In 1922, Howard Carter broke through a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and found the impossible. Gold everywhere. A royal coffin gleaming like a sun that had refused to die. A boy king, Tutankhamun, pulled out of darkness and into the modern imagination. For many people, that was the ending. The valley had spoken. Its greatest secret had been opened. The age of discovery was over. But that belief was wrong, because after the golden coffin, the Valley of the Kings did not fall silent. It became stranger, less dazzling perhaps, but far more revealing. The real mystery was no longer simply what treasure had survived. It was what the valley still knew. And the valley, as Egyptologists would learn, had a long memory. Not every discovery came wrapped in gold. Some arrived as broken jars, displaced bodies, reused coffins, flood debris, scraps of linen, names almost rubbed away by time. They did not glitter under camera lights. They did something more dangerous. They complicated the story. They showed that this royal cemetery was not a frozen museum of ancient death. It was a place of panic, devotion, robbery, repair, politics, and ritual improvisation. Tonight, we step beyond the familiar glow of Tutankhamun's tomb into the quieter discoveries that followed it. Discoveries that changed how archaeologists understood not just one pharaoh, but the entire hidden life of the Valley of the Kings. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Because the most haunting truth about King Tut's discovery may be this: it did not close the book. It opened a door, and beyond that door waited bodies without certainty, tombs without kings, princes nearly erased from memory, and a landscape that kept rearranging the dead long after their funerals were over. The Valley of the Kings was never just a cemetery. That is the first misconception to leave behind. It is easy to imagine the place as a kind of ancient archive, with tombs arranged like sealed files in a desert cabinet. One king, one chamber, one burial, one story. But the valley was never that orderly. It was chosen for death, yes, but it was shaped by life, by royal ambition, priestly anxiety, geological accident, and the very human habit of returning to places that were supposed to be finished. The kings who were buried there were not simply hiding their bodies, they were making a claim. A tomb in the valley was a political statement carved into limestone. It said that the king had ruled on earth, had joined the gods, and would continue to exist in a sacred geography that only the living could maintain. Every corridor, every painted wall, every descending passage was built around an enormous hope that the royal body could be protected long enough for eternity to do its work. But hope is not the same thing as security. The valley had guards, workers, priests, officials, and rituals of concealment. It also had robbers. It had corrupt insiders. It had droughts, succession crises, collapsing authority, and generations of people who knew roughly where the old kings lay. The tombs were hidden, but not invisible. Their secrecy depended on a society continuing to function well enough to protect them. And that is where the story becomes less like legend and more like administration. A royal burial required astonishing coordination. Stonecutters had to carve the chambers. Artists had to prepare the walls. Priests had to perform ceremonies. Embalmers had to transform a corpse into something sacred and durable. Officials had to move objects, seal doors, record inventories, and guard access. The afterlife for a pharaoh was not a simple belief floating above the world. It was a logistical project, and logistical projects leave traces: a chipped stairway, a plastered doorway, a fragment of pottery in a place it should not be, a mummy found far from the tomb originally intended for it. a coffin reused for someone else. These details are not glamorous in the way Tutankhamun's mask is glamorous, but they may tell us more about how the valley actually worked, because the Valley of the Kings was not frozen at the moment of burial. It was entered again, altered again, violated, repaired, resealed, and sometimes quietly rearranged. In some cases, tomb robbers broke in for valuables. In others, priests and officials moved royal bodies to safer locations, trying to preserve what they could after the outer protections failed. Later generations reused spaces that earlier generations had treated as sacred or royal. Floods swept through entrances and chambers. Debris covered doorways. Rockfalls changed the shape of the landscape. A tomb could disappear not because someone planned a perfect hiding place, but because time itself became an accomplice. This matters because every tomb in the valley has two histories. There is the history it was meant to tell, the official, sacred story of a king's journey into the next world. And then there is the history it accidentally records: fear, damage, theft, neglect, rescue, confusion, and survival. Those two histories do not always agree. A chamber painted for eternal order may contain evidence of disorder. A burial prepared with sacred precision may have been disturbed within a generation. A mummy placed in one tomb may belong to a person originally buried somewhere else. A coffin may carry one identity and contain another. Even silence can become evidence. When a missing object tells us that someone came back with a purpose. This is why the valley refused to stay simple. The more archaeologists studied it, the less it looked like a collection of royal graves, and the more it looked like a landscape under pressure. Kings wanted permanence. Priests tried to maintain it. Robbers attacked it. Nature buried it. Modern archaeology then arrived and had to separate intention from accident, ritual from repair, and original burial from later interference. That is the difficulty. A tomb is not only what its builders made, it is also what everyone after them did to it. So when we speak of secrets in the Valley of the Kings, we are not always speaking of sealed doors or hidden treasure. Sometimes the secret is a sequence of decisions. Who moved a body? Who stripped a coffin? Who chose to hide one mummy beside another? Who reused a chamber that had once belonged to royalty? Who patched a damaged entrance? Who left something behind because it no longer seemed worth carrying? The valley remembers these choices, but not in complete sentences. It remembers them in fragments. And after Tutankhamun, those fragments became impossible to ignore. After Tutankhamun, the question changed. For the public, the discovery in 1922 became almost impossible to separate from its gold. That is understandable. Gold photographs well. Gold survives the centuries with a kind of insulting confidence. Gold turns a burial into an icon, and an icon into a myth that can travel far beyond archaeology. But archaeology is not, at its best, the study of beautiful things. It is the study of evidence, and evidence is often unattractive. It comes broken. It comes mislabeled. It comes without the dramatic courtesy of explaining itself. It may be a stain on a cloth, a pattern in debris, an awkwardly reused coffin, a burial that does not match the person inside it, or a group of objects that look like leftovers until someone asks why they were left there in the first place. That is why the post-Tutankhamun discoveries in the Valley of the Kings are so important. They did not necessarily outshine the Golden Tomb. Nothing was likely to do that, and in a way, that was a gift. Once the fantasy of another Tutankhamun began to fade, a more serious question could take its place. Not where is the next treasure, but what was really happening here? And that shift may sound modest. It was not. It changed the valley from a stage for discovery into a field of investigation. Tutankhamun's tomb had survived in unusually rich condition, but even it was not untouched in the absolute sense. It had been entered in antiquity, then sealed again. Its survival depended on a combination of burial practice, later construction activity, debris, and chance. The tomb's fame can make it feel like a miracle standing outside history, but it belongs to the same troubled landscape as all the others. That is the useful correction. The golden tomb was not an exception that explained the valley. It was an exception that exposed the questions. Why did some burials survive better than others? How were royal bodies prepared? What happened when tombs were robbed? Who decided to move mummies from their original resting places? How did priests respond when the royal dead became vulnerable? How often were coffins, chambers, and funerary equipment reused? And what does reuse mean in a culture that treated names, bodies, and ritual objects as sacred? These are not small questions. They change the emotional weight of the place. A robbed tomb is not merely a failure of security. It is evidence of a society under strain. A reburied mummy is not only a displaced corpse. It may be the result of an emergency decision made by people trying to rescue the remains of kings whose monuments could no longer defend them. An embalming cache is not just a storage deposit. It can reveal the practical side of immortality. Linen, natron, jars, resins, tools, and the sacred mess of preparing a body for eternity. There is something almost uncomfortable about that. The royal afterlife, when seen from a distance, looks grand and finished. Painted gods, long corridors, spells of protection, a monarch becoming divine. But the evidence brings it back down to human hands. Someone folded the linen. Someone sealed the jar. Someone carried the coffin. Someone checked the door. Someone came back years later and found that the system had failed. Someone made a decision in a damaged chamber with limited time, limited authority, and perhaps no perfect option. This is where the Valley of the Kings becomes more than a place of death. It becomes a record of maintenance. That word may seem too plain for pharaohs. Maintenance belongs to roofs, boats, tax ledgers, and tired officials, not to divine kingship. But it is exactly the word that helps us understand the valley after Tutankhamun. Eternal life had to be maintained. Sacred order had to be maintained. Tomb secrecy had to be maintained. Memory had to be maintained. And when maintenance failed, repair became part of the archaeological record. The discoveries that followed Tutankhamun revealed a world where royal burial was not a single ceremony, but a long afterlife of interventions. Bodies could be moved. Identities could become confused. Tombs could be reused by people who lived centuries after the original owners. Family members could vanish from memory, not because they were unimportant, but because the physical record preserving them was fragile, scattered, or damaged. That is why quieter finds matter. A spectacular object can dominate the eye so completely that it stops inquiry for a moment. It makes us admire. It makes us gasp. But a confusing object makes us think. It forces comparison. It refuses to behave. It asks why a thing is where it is, why it looks altered, why it belongs to one period but appears in another, why a royal landscape kept absorbing new meanings long after its most famous burials were made. This is also where the idea of treasure begins to change. For treasure hunters, treasure is what can be carried away. For archaeology, treasure is often what can be understood. A coffin without its expected occupant may be a better clue than a jewel. A jar of embalming material may tell us more about ritual practice than a necklace. A damaged burial may reveal more about political collapse than an intact chamber ever could. The value lies not in beauty alone, but in the way objects preserve decisions. And the valley is full of decisions. Some were made in confidence, when kings commanded labor, and theology worked in perfect union with power. Some were made in fear. Some were made centuries later, by people who inherited a sacred landscape already crowded with the dead of previous ages. This is the deeper story after Tutankhamun. The famous tomb did not make the valley simple. It made the valley irresistible. And then the valley slowly taught archaeologists to look past spectacle. The gold opened the door for public fascination, but the less glamorous evidence opened a different door, one that led toward embalming workshops, family burials, displaced pharaohs, reused chambers, and the uneasy politics of protecting the dead when the living world had changed. So the search continued. Not always for a sealed royal burial, not always for a name that would make headlines. Sometimes it continued inside tombs already known, in corners that had been photographed but not fully understood, in objects that had been catalogued but not truly interpreted, in old reports whose details suddenly mattered again. The valley did not need to produce another golden king to keep speaking. It only needed archaeologists willing to listen differently. Many of the valley's later revelations did not begin with a dramatic new doorway. They began with a second look. That may sound less romantic than a sealed entrance appearing beneath the desert floor, but in archaeology, looking again can be an act of quiet rebellion. It means refusing to let the first interpretation become the final one. It means admitting that discovery is not only a moment with a lantern and a crowd of witnesses. Sometimes discovery happens years later, in a photograph, a field notebook, a damaged inscription, or a chamber everyone thought they already understood. The Valley of the Kings is especially vulnerable to first impressions. Its tombs encourage them. A painted corridor pulls the eye forward. A royal name suggests an owner. A burial chamber seems to declare its purpose. A broken object appears to be only debris. An empty coffin appears to be only absence. Early explorers, working under difficult conditions and often under the pressure of competition, did not always have the time, tools, or methods to ask every question the evidence deserved. Some were careful, some were not. The valley received both kinds. There were scholars who recorded with patience, and there were men who treated ancient spaces like prize cabinets. There were conservators trying to preserve what remained, and there were visitors whose curiosity was not always gentle. The history of modern archaeology in the valley is not a clean moral ladder rising from ignorance to enlightenment. It is more uneven than that. Each generation inherited not only ancient damage, but modern damage too, and still, the tombs kept offering new information. Not because the stone changed, because the questions changed. A century ago, a tomb might have been valued mainly for its decoration, its owner, or the possibility that objects remained inside. Later, researchers began to ask about construction marks, tool traces, flood deposits, plaster repairs, soot stains, intrusive pottery, fragments of human remains, and the way one chamber related to another. A corridor was no longer just a passage. It was a record of labor. A crack was no longer just decay. It might explain water movement. A pile of debris was no longer simply something to clear. It might preserve the sequence of disturbance. This is the discipline's humbling lesson. An archaeological site can be known and still be unread. Mapping changed that. Careful plans made it possible to compare tombs not only as isolated monuments, but as parts of a larger landscape. Where was the entrance placed? How did it relate to nearby tombs? What did the slope of the valley do during sudden rain? Which areas collected debris? Which pathways would ancient workers have used? Which tombs were visible, hidden, blocked, cut into, or nearly overlapping? These are not decorative questions. They are the difference between seeing the valley as a tourist map and seeing it as a machine of memory, failure, and survival. Photography also altered the story. A camera could capture details too faint or too fragile for the eye during a brief inspection. Repeated photographs allowed scholars to track deterioration. Older images became evidence of things that had since faded, cracked, been restored, or been lost. In a place where even preservation can change the surface it tries to protect, the photograph became a second tomb wall, imperfect, selective, but sometimes the only witness left. Epigraphy, the painstaking recording of inscriptions and scenes, added another layer. A royal cartouche could confirm, complicate, or mislead. A changed name could point toward politics. A damaged figure might reveal an act of erasure. A painted text might preserve theology, but also workshop habits, artistic sequence, and moments where human hands adjusted sacred ideas to the limits of a wall. The old assumption was that tomb decoration simply expressed belief. It does, but it also expresses decisions. What was included? What was omitted? What was corrected? What was unfinished? What was damaged later? What was restored? And how? Even silence on a wall can have texture. Then came the study of bodies and materials. Forensic examination, when handled carefully, shifted the focus from royal names to physical lives. Age, injury, disease, embalming methods, and family relationships could be investigated, though not always with the certainty that headlines prefer. Scientific tools offered possibilities, but they did not turn every mystery into a solved case. A scan can reveal a fracture. It cannot always reveal the story people build around that fracture. DNA may suggest relationships, but interpretation still depends on sample quality, context, and caution. The Valley has taught this lesson repeatedly. Technology is powerful, but it is not magic. It can sharpen a question. It cannot always close it. Material analysis did something similar for objects. Linen, resin, pottery, wood, pigments, and natron began to speak in ways they had not spoken before. A jar was no longer just a jar. It could be part of an embalming process, a ritual deposit, a later intrusion, or a clue to storage and movement. Wood could reveal reuse. Textiles could show preparation. Pigments could illuminate workshop practice. The smallest materials made the largest claims feel more grounded. This is where older tombs became new again. Not because someone invented a more exciting story for them, but because the evidence became denser. The same chamber could be reinterpreted when placed beside better maps, cleaner photographs, improved conservation records, and comparative data from other tombs. What had once looked like a simple burial might become a sequence of use, disturbance, and reuse. What had seemed like a minor find might connect to a larger pattern across the valley. There is a certain dignity in this kind of archaeology. It does not depend on the fantasy of untouched rooms. It accepts that the past usually reaches us damaged, partial, and inconvenient. It asks for patience instead of spectacle. It treats fragments not as disappointments, but as fragments, which is to say, as pieces of something that once had a place. And it also changes the moral posture of the viewer. The golden discovery invites awe. Re-examination invites responsibility. To look again is to admit that earlier generations may have missed something, mishandled something, or asked the wrong question. It is also to admit that we might be doing the same. The valley is not finished simply because modern methods feel advanced. Future archaeologists may look back on today's certainty with the same careful skepticism now applied to the past. That is not a weakness. It is the point. The Valley of the Kings has survived too many centuries, too many hands, and too many interpretations to be reduced to a single reading. It must be approached as a layered document, and some of its pages have been burned, rewritten, washed over, or filed in the wrong place. So the work continued in old tombs with new eyes, in chambers already numbered, in bodies already examined, in photographs already archived, in names already known, but not fully understood. And one of the most unsettling examples lay in a small, damaged tomb that seemed to contain not merely a burial, but the wreckage of a religious revolution. In 1907, a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings gave archaeology one of its most uncomfortable gifts, a body that seemed to belong to a crisis. The tomb is known as Cave 55. The name is plain, almost bureaucratic, which is useful because almost everything else about it has been argued over. It was not a grand tomb by royal standards. It did not offer the clean satisfaction of a sealed royal burial with an owner's name neatly attached. It was damaged, confusing, and full of objects that appeared to point in more than one direction at once. That is what made it dangerous. Not physically dangerous, in the old newspaper sense of curses and feverish imagination. Dangerous to certainty. KV 55 seemed to open a side door into one of the most controversial periods in Egyptian history. The Amarna Age, the time of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who turned royal religion toward the Aten, moved the center of power to a new city, and left behind a legacy that later generations appear to have treated with deep hostility. Even today, the period attracts bold claims because it feels like a rupture. A king changes religious focus, art changes, royal imagery changes, names are attacked, memory itself becomes a battleground, and in KV 55 memory looked injured. The tomb contained a set of remains whose identity has long been disputed. Some have connected the body to Akhenaten. Others have argued for another member of the Amarna royal family, including possibilities tied to Tutankhamun's close relatives. Any firm identification should be approached with caution. The evidence has been studied, restudied, measured, scanned, debated, and interpreted through changing scientific methods. But the question remains sensitive enough that a confident answer can become misleading very quickly. So let us say it carefully. The body in KV 55 may belong to a figure closely connected with the Amarna royal family. It may be Akhenaten himself. It may be another royal male from that troubled line. What we can say with more confidence is that the tomb feels less like a serene royal resting place and more like an emergency solution. That is the key. KV 55 does not merely ask, "Who is this?" And it asks, "What happened so badly that this was the result?" Inside the tomb were traces suggesting a burial assembled from pieces of a disrupted world. Objects associated with the Amarna period appeared in a Theban valley that later kings used to restore more traditional religious and political order. A coffin had been altered. Names and identifying marks had suffered damage or removal. The material setting gave the impression of a burial caught between reverence and rejection, between the need to preserve a royal body and the desire to erase a dangerous memory. That contradiction is what gives KV 55 its power. Ancient Egypt is often imagined as a civilization obsessed with continuity, and in many ways it was. Its art, rituals, and royal ideology could make time seem almost circular, as if each king stepped into a pattern older than himself and left it intact for the next. But KV 55 reminds us that continuity was sometimes repaired after rupture. It was not always calm. It could be forced, edited, even improvised. The Amarna period created a problem for later Egyptians. How do you deal with the dead of a regime whose religious experiment has become unacceptable? You cannot simply pretend the bodies do not exist. These were royal bodies, and royal bodies mattered. They were not just remains. They were vessels of identity, ritual obligation, dynastic memory, and political risk. Yet preserving them too openly could preserve the very memory later rulers wanted to control. That tension may be written into KV 55. The tomb seems to speak in the language of compromise. Move what must be moved, conceal what must be concealed, remove names that should not be honored, but do not abandon the dead entirely. If that reading is right, KV 55 is not just a tomb. It is a negotiation between theology and family, between state policy and burial duty, between erasure and fear of erasure. And this is where this mystery becomes more human than the headlines usually allow. The question is not only whether a famous heretic king lay in that chamber. The question is whether someone, at some point, had to decide how much dignity a disgraced royal deserved. That decision would not have been simple. The Amarna royal family was tied to Tutankhamun in ways that archaeology has tried to reconstruct through names, objects, bodies, and genetic study. But family is not only biology. In a royal court, family is succession, legitimacy, danger, and propaganda. A dead relative can support a claim to rule or threaten it. A name can be preserved because it matters, or destroyed because that matters too much. In K555, damaged identity becomes part of the evidence. The altered coffin is especially haunting because a coffin is supposed to do the opposite. It is meant to name, protect, and transform. It gives the dead person a sacred surface. It wraps the body in theology. It does not merely contain someone. It announces who that someone is in a world where names had power. To alter such an object is not a casual act. It suggests intention, but intention is difficult to read across 3,000 years. A removed name may be punishment. It may be protection. It may be reuse. It may be part of a hurried attempt to adapt available funerary equipment under pressure. Archaeology can identify the alteration. Interpreting the motive is harder. That is why KV 55 resists easy storytelling. It tempts us toward drama. The fallen heretic, the hidden body, the erased name, the family secret lying near the tomb of Tutankhamun. All of that is compelling, and some of it may point toward real historical tensions. But the evidence does not give permission for every dramatic conclusion built on it. The honest mystery is sharper. A damaged burial connected to the Amarna world was placed in the Valley of the Kings. The remains inside have been the subject of serious dispute. The objects and alterations suggest a complicated afterlife for a royal person whose identity, status, or memory had become politically charged. That is already extraordinary. It does not need to be inflated. In fact, exaggeration makes KV 55 smaller. It turns a genuinely difficult archaeological problem into a guessing game. The more interesting version is slower and colder. A royal body, perhaps once honored, perhaps later inconvenient, ends up in a tomb that feels provisional. The burial equipment does not speak with one clear voice. The signs of identity have been damaged. The historical period surrounding it is one of religious reversal and dynastic vulnerability. And nearby, in both geography and memory, stands Tutankhamun, the young king whose own reign helped move Egypt away from the Amarna experiment and back toward older forms of worship. That proximity matters, but carefully. It does not mean every object in KV 55 can be folded neatly into Tutankhamun's story. It means that the valley preserves overlapping consequences. Tutankhamun's golden burial and KV 55's disturbed ambiguity belong to the same wider family crisis. One became a symbol of wonder. The other became a problem that would not settle down, and perhaps that is appropriate. Gold simplifies. It dazzles the eye into reverence. KV 55 unsettles. It asks us to imagine the afterlife, not as a peaceful destination, but as something vulnerable to politics. Even a king's eternity could be revised by later hands. Even sacred protection could be interrupted by a change in doctrine. Even the body of a royal person could become difficult evidence. There is a grim lesson in that. Pharaohs built tombs to defeat time, but they also had to survive memory, and memory in ancient Egypt could be more dangerous than decay. A flood might bury a doorway, a robber might strip a chamber, but a political reversal could attack the name itself. It could decide which kings belonged to the proper order of history and which should be pushed into a kind of official darkness. KV55 appears to come from that darkness. Not completely lost, not completely preserved, suspended. That is why the tomb continues to matter. Not because it gives us a clean answer, but because it preserves the shape of a question that the ancient world may have wanted to hide. Somewhere in its damaged objects and disputed remains is the trace of a family and a regime trying to pass through disgrace, restoration, and death without leaving a stable story behind. And for archaeologists, unstable stories can be the most revealing. They show where the official version cracked. They show where ritual met politics and did not know which one should win. They show that the Valley of the Kings was not only a place where Egypt buried its rulers in splendor, but a place where it sometimes buried its crises. Cave 555 is one of those crises, reduced to stone, bone, wood, and absence. And once you understand that, the valley begins to look different, not as a row of royal monuments, not as a treasure field, but as a landscape where the dead were moved, hidden, renamed, stripped, defended, and sometimes placed far from where eternity had first been promised to them. In another tomb, the problem was not one disputed body. It was too many bodies in the wrong place. KIE 35 was originally cut for Amenhotep II, a powerful king of the 18th dynasty. On its own, that would already make the tomb important. A royal burial chamber, painted and prepared for a pharaoh, is never a minor thing. But KV35 became something stranger than the resting place of one ruler. It became a gathering point for royal dead who had not begun their eternity there. That is the detail that changes everything. When modern investigators entered and studied the tomb, they encountered not only the burial of Amenhotep II, but other mummies hidden in side chambers. Some were royal. Some were among the most famous rulers Egypt ever produced. Their presence there revealed a truth that is easy to miss if we imagine the Valley of the Kings as a sealed map of original burials. The dead had been moved, not as an isolated accident, as a practice. At some point in the long afterlife of the valley, priests and officials appear to have gathered vulnerable royal mummies and placed them in safer, more concealed locations. KV35 was one of those places. It was not simply a tomb anymore. It had become a refuge, an improvised archive of royal bodies, a room where the failures of the entire burial system had been quietly acknowledged. And this is where the grandeur of ancient Egypt becomes painfully practical. A king could be buried with spells, gods, amulets, coffins, sealed corridors, and all the symbolic equipment of eternal power. But if the tomb was robbed, if the coffin was damaged, if the body itself was threatened, someone still had to make a decision. Do we leave him? Do we repair what can be repaired? Do we move him? And if we move him, where? That is not the question of a civilization floating in myth. It is the question of exhausted administrators facing a sacred emergency. KV35 shows us the Valley of the Kings after the ideal had failed. Not completely failed. That would be too simple. The very act of moving the mummies suggests that people still cared. They still believed the royal dead required protection. They still rated the body as something more than remains. But the original plan, the perfect plan, the idea that a king could be sealed away forever in his own hidden monument, had broken under pressure. Robbery was part of that pressure. The valley was rich in precisely the way that made it vulnerable. Royal tombs contained precious materials, and over time, as political authority weakened or local knowledge passed through generations, the temptation and opportunity for theft grew. But robbery is only one layer of the story. There were also restorations, inspections, rewrappings, reburials, and perhaps the uneasy cooperation of people trying to preserve sanctity in a landscape already compromised. The phrase tomb robber is useful, but it can flatten the human range of what happened. Some people came to steal, some came to repair, some may have done both, or worked within systems where official action and opportunism were not always cleanly separated. The archaeology of moved mummies forces us to give up the comforting idea that the ancient dead were either respected or violated. Often, they were both at different times, by different hands, for different reasons. That is why KV35 feels so revealing. It shows pharaohs out of place, and being out of place is a kind of historical confession. A royal mummy in its intended tomb tells one story: preparation, status, ritual order. A royal mummy hidden in another king's side chamber tells a different story: danger, recovery, triage. It says that the living returned to the dead not for ceremony alone, but because the dead had become exposed. There is a strange intimacy in that. The kings of Egypt are usually presented at a distance, larger than life, carved in profile, crowned, named, idealized. But a moved mummy reduces the distance. It reminds us that behind every divine title was a physical body that could be damaged, carried, unwrapped, examined, patched, labeled, and hidden. Even a pharaoh could become a problem of storage. There is the dry humor, if one can call it that, of history. The king who once commanded armies and tribute might later depend on someone choosing the least unsafe chamber in a robbed valley. But that does not make the story ridiculous. It makes it more serious, because those choices preserved bodies that might otherwise have been lost entirely. The ancient rescuers, whatever their motives and limitations, became unwilling collaborators with modern archaeology. By moving royal mummies into caches like those associated with K535, they disrupted original contexts, yes. They also saved evidence on a scale that is difficult to overstate. The price of survival was confusion. A body saved from destruction might be separated from its original tomb. A coffin might not belong neatly to the person inside it. Labels and wrappings might help, or mislead, or raise new questions. Later, investigators then had to reconstruct not just who these people were, but how they had arrived where they were found. KV35 therefore asks for a different kind of reading. Not, who was buried here first, but who was brought here later and why. That later history matters just as much as the original burial. The tomb's meaning expanded over time. It began as the eternal house of Amenhotep II. It later became part of a defensive network for royal remains. The tomb was not merely used, it was repurposed under historical pressure. This is one of the valley's deepest lessons. Sacred spaces do not remain sacred in only one way. Their meaning can change while their importance remains. A tomb can shift from royal monument to hiding place. A burial chamber can become a protective storeroom. A side room can become a last refuge for kings whose own monuments no longer protected them. The sanctity is not erased by reuse. It is transformed by necessity. That word again, necessity. So much of the valley after Tutankhamun makes more sense when we stop imagining ancient Egyptians as people who always acted according to ideal ritual plans. Ritual mattered enormously, but real history is what happens when ritual meets crisis. When the tomb has been opened, when the gold is gone. when the coffin is broken, when the king's body must not be left where robbers can find it again. K535 preserves that moment of compromise. It is not elegant. It is not the golden fantasy. It is something more revealing. A glimpse of people trying to rescue eternity after eternity had been breached. And once the dead were moved, the valley could never again be understood as a simple arrangement of kings in their proper places. The map had become layered. A tomb's owner was not always the only person inside it. The chamber's original purpose was not always its final purpose. Later priests and officials had written themselves into the archaeology, not by building monuments of their own, but by rearranging the monuments of others. That rearrangement was not random. It followed fear, access, memory, and practical judgment. Which tomb could be entered? Which could be sealed? Which bodies were worth saving? Which names still mattered? Which coffins could be used? Which spaces were hidden enough, dry enough, defensible enough? Every answer left a trace. In KV35, those traces turned a royal tomb into a document of damage control. It is tempting to see this as decline, and in one sense it is. The old system of royal protection had weakened. The tombs had been compromised. The state that once built these monuments could no longer guarantee their safety in the same way. But decline is not the whole story. There is also care. Imperfect care, perhaps. Urgent care. Care mixed with politics, scarcity, and fear. But care all the same. Someone looked at the disturbed royal dead and decided they should not simply be abandoned to the open mouth of history. Someone gathered them, moved them, and placed them where they might survive a little longer. That decision carried them across thousands of years, and it changes the way we should look at the Valley of the Kings. The valley was not a sealed cemetery frozen after its last burial. It was a place repeatedly entered by people trying to control the consequences of earlier failure. Priests, officials, robbers, restorers, and eventually archaeologists all became part of its story. Each group touched the dead differently. Each believed, in some way, that they had a reason. KV35 makes that impossible to ignore. The tomb is not only about Amenhotep II. It is about the afterlife of the afterlife. The long, uneasy period after the funeral, when the king's journey through eternity depended on the very mortal actions of people still walking through the valley's heat, still unlocking doors, still carrying bodies by torchlight or daylight, or whatever conditions necessity allowed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. The pharaohs were buried as gods, but they survived because human beings kept making decisions. Not perfect decisions, not always transparent ones, but decisions made in rooms where reverence and fear had to share the same air. From KV35 onward, the valley looks less like a place of final rest and more like a place of repeated intervention. Tombs were not just endings, they were sites of return. A burial could be reopened not only by thieves, but by protectors. A sealed chamber could become temporary. A royal body could travel after death. And once death begins to move, the landscape itself becomes unstable. The question is no longer simply where the kings were buried. It is where they were taken when the first promise failed. For all the labor Egypt poured into hiding its kings, one of the valley's most effective guardians was never human. It was the weather. That may sound strange in a desert. The Valley of the Kings is not a place most people associate with water. Its colors suggest dryness before anything else. Pale limestone, hard slopes, bare ridges, a landscape scraped clean by sun. But deserts do not need frequent rain to be dangerous. They need rare rain falling hard, with nowhere gentle to go. When sudden storms strike the Theban hills, Water can rush through the valley with violent speed. It pours down slopes, drags stones and silt with it, and turns dry channels into temporary forces of destruction. A tomb entrance that seems safely cut into rock can become part of a flood path. A stairway can collect debris. A corridor can become a drain. A sealed doorway can be battered, buried, or hidden beneath the washed-down remains of the landscape above it. Floods damaged the valley. They also preserved it. That is the contradiction. Nature was not simply an enemy of the tombs. It was an unpredictable archivist, destroying one clue while protecting another. Water could tear into chambers, stain walls, move objects, and leave behind thick deposits of mud and rubble. But debris could also conceal entrances from robbers, later builders, and casual eyes. What was buried might be forgotten. What was forgotten might survive. Tutankhamun's tomb is the most famous example of survival aided by circumstance. Its entrance was hidden beneath later debris and activity, and that accidental concealment helped protect it in ways no official plan could guarantee. The tomb was not preserved because the ancient security system worked perfectly. It survived because the valley's later history partly covered it over. That should make us pause. The most famous archaeological discovery in Egypt was not simply a triumph of royal planning. It was also a triumph of interruption. A doorway disappeared beneath the mess of time. Later construction and flood-borne material helped obscure it. The valley, unintentionally, made the boy king harder to find. And because he became harder to find, more of his burial survived long enough to astonish the modern world. There is a lesson here that archaeology understands better than romance does. Preservation is often accidental. We prefer clean stories. A king hides his tomb, the tomb remains sealed, an explorer finds it. But real preservation is messier. It depends on geology, weather, human movement, later building, erosion, collapse, theft, neglect, and chance. The thing that saves an artifact may have nothing to do with the intentions of the people who made it. A pot survives because it broke in a corner no one cleared. A doorway survives because a flood buried it. A chamber survives because it was not worth robbing twice. A fragment of linen survives because conditions were just dry enough, just protected enough, just overlooked enough. In the valley, survival is not always a sign of importance. Sometimes it is a sign of luck, and luck leaves deposits. To understand the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists had to learn to read not only what humans placed there, but what the landscape did afterward. Flood layers, rubble fills, erosion patterns, cracks, blocked entrances, and sediment inside tombs all became part of the evidence. The valley was no longer a passive backdrop for royal death. It was an active force in the history of the tombs. This is one of the quiet revolutions in how the place came to be studied. A tomb cannot be understood only from the inside. The walls may hold texts, the chambers may hold objects, the burial may hold a name, but outside, the valley determines what happens next. A tomb cut low in the path of runoff faces a different future from one placed higher. An entrance exposed on a slope is not the same as one gradually hidden by debris. The angle of the land, the behavior of water, and the movement of loose stone all shape the afterlife of the dead. The ancient builders knew the landscape, of course. They were not foolish. They selected, cut, sealed, and concealed with skill. But they could not control centuries of storms. They could not predict every rockfall, every channel of runoff, every future generation's construction, every collapse of political order that might leave the valley less guarded. They designed for eternity. The valley answered in geology. And geology has a very different sense of time. It does not care about royal names. It does not distinguish between a famous pharaoh and a forgotten prince. It carries debris where gravity sends it. It opens cracks. It fills hollows. It wears down surfaces. It hides and exposes without intention. That lack of intention is exactly what makes it so powerful. A human enemy can be anticipated. A robber wants valuables. A priest wants protection. An official wants order. But nature has no motive to interpret. It changes the site without caring what its changes mean. And yet, to archaeologists, those changes mean everything. A flood deposit can reveal that a tomb was open at a certain stage. A layer of debris can show that an entrance had been blocked long before modern excavation. Water damage on a wall can distinguish ancient exposure from later disturbance. Sediment can explain why objects were found out of place. Even destruction can become a timestamp, if read carefully enough. This is why the valley's secrets are not only hidden behind sealed doors. Some are buried in the layers outside them. The stone above a tomb, the slope leading down to it, the washed material packed against its steps. These can tell a story as important as the burial chamber itself. A tomb is not just an architectural space. It is a place that continued to have a physical history after the funeral ended. And that physical history could be brutal. Imagine a storm breaking over the hills after years of dryness. At first, perhaps the air changes. Then rain hits rock that cannot absorb it fast enough. Water gathers, accelerates, and begins to pull the hillside apart grain by grain, stone by stone. It runs into old cuts and hidden openings. It pounds at blocked entrances. It carries fragments of the valley into the tombs of kings. There is no drama in the storm's mind, only movement. By morning, the valley may look still again. The sun returns. The surface dries. A new layer lies where the flood left it. Something has been damaged. Something else has been hidden a little better than before. That is how a landscape keeps secrets without meaning to. It is also how it erases them. The same flood that concealed one entrance might destroy evidence in another. The same debris that protected a stairway might crush fragile material beneath it. The same geological process that saved Tutankhamun's tomb from easy detection may have made other tombs harder to interpret, or helped ensure that some evidence was lost before anyone could record it. So we should be careful when we speak of the valley as if it has chosen what to reveal. It has not chosen, but it has shaped the record so deeply that the metaphor becomes almost irresistible. The valley seems to decide, not because it has a will, but because its natural forces have filtered what survived. It allowed some stories to pass forward and forced others into silence. This gives the post-Tutankhamun discoveries a different mood. They are not just finds made by determined archaeologists. They are encounters with a landscape that has been sorting evidence for thousands of years. Every discovery is partly a conversation with what remains, and what remains has been edited by floodwater, falling rock, dust, heat, burial, exposure, and time. The valley is not a library. It is a damaged library after a fire, a theft, a flood, and several generations of people trying to reorganize the shelves in the dark. That may be less romantic than the usual image, but it is closer to the truth, and it makes each survival more astonishing. Not because it proves the ancients mastered eternity, but because it shows how fragile eternity always was. A king's burial could depend on a sealed door, a guard's loyalty, a priest's intervention, a robber's ignorance, a storm's direction, and a blanket of debris settling in exactly the right place. The Valley of the Kings became famous for gold, but its deeper history is written in movement. Bodies moved by priests, objects moved by robbers, names moved through memory, and earth moved by water that came rarely enough to be underestimated and violently enough to change everything. This is why flood debris is not just dirt in the story. It is one of the story's authors. Without it, some tombs might have been stripped even more thoroughly. With it, some evidence became sealed beneath accidental cover. Against it, modern excavators had to work carefully, not merely clearing rubble but reading it before it disappeared. Because the rubble was not empty, it was the valley's handwriting. And once archaeologists began to take that handwriting seriously, the search for secrets expanded again. They were no longer only looking for decorated chambers and royal coffins. They were looking for patterns in the land itself. The way water traveled, the way debris gathered, the way old entrances vanished beneath the surface until they looked like nothing at all. Somewhere under that surface, a neglected entrance could still change the map. And in one astonishing case, a tomb once dismissed and underestimated would open into something far larger than anyone expected. For a long time, KV5 did not look like the kind of tomb that would rewrite anyone's sense of the Valley of the Kings. It was known but not understood. That distinction matters. A thing can be on a map and still be invisible in every meaningful way. KV5 had been noted by earlier explorers, but damage, debris, flooding, and the general difficulty of the site made it easy to underestimate. It did not present itself with the clean drama of a sealed royal chamber. It did not politely announce, "There is an underground city behind this entrance." Ancient tombs rarely have such good manners. Instead, KV5 waited in plain sight. And then, through renewed exploration and careful work, it began to expand. Room after room, corridor after corridor, a tomb that had seemed minor gradually revealed itself as one of the largest and most complex structures in the Valley of the Kings. Its association with the sons of Ramesses II transformed it from an overlooked entry in the valley's inventory into something far more revealing. A monument not only to death, but to dynasty on a scale almost difficult to absorb. Ramesses II is one of those kings whose reputation threatens to crowd out everyone around him. Even people with only a casual interest in ancient Egypt tend to recognize the name. His reign was long. His monuments were vast. His image was everywhere. He built, claimed, celebrated, and inscribed with the confidence of a man who expected history to make room. History did. But KV5 reminds us that royal power was not carried by the king alone. It was carried by family, by sons, by succession, by the careful staging of legitimacy across generations. The tomb's connection to multiple royal sons changes the emotional architecture of the valley. We are used to imagining it as a place of singular kings, one ruler descending into his own prepared eternity. K55 complicates that image. It suggests a burial project shaped around the royal household, around the problem of many princes born into the orbit of an exceptionally dominant father. And Ramesses II had many children. That fact is often mentioned almost casually, as if it were a colorful footnote to a famous reign. But in political terms, royal children were not simply family members. They were possible heirs, diplomatic instruments, ritual participants, military figures, symbols of abundance, and sometimes future problems. A large royal family was a sign of strength, but also a management challenge. Every prince had a name, a rank, a mother, a place in the courtly order, and a relationship to succession. KV5 gives that abstraction a physical form. It is not just a tomb with many rooms. It is power translated into architecture. The scale feels almost bureaucratic in its ambition, and that may be the point. A king like Ramesses II did not merely need a place for his own eternal identity. His reign generated an entire royal constellation around him. The sons mattered because they reflected him. Their status helped broadcast the fertility, stability, and continuity of his house. To bury them within the sacred landscape of kingship was not just an act of mourning. It was a statement about the reach of Ramesside power. But the tomb does not give that statement back to us whole. It gives it back damaged. Floods had invaded. Debris had filled spaces. Time had broken the easy readability of the monument. The rediscovery of K55 was therefore not a single magical unveiling, but a long confrontation with obstruction. The tomb had to be cleared, mapped, stabilized, interpreted. Its importance emerged through persistence rather than spectacle. This is exactly why it belongs in the story after Tutankhamun. KV5 was not a golden room waiting to stun the world in one glance. It was a buried argument for patience. It rewarded the kind of archaeology that does not dismiss the ugly entrance, the choked corridor, the site that seems already known, the place where earlier eyes saw too little. And when its complexity became clear, the valley itself seemed to grow. Not physically, of course. The cliffs had not moved. The main paths were still there. The numbered tombs still held their positions. But conceptually, K55 made the Valley of the Kings larger. It showed that an entrance could conceal an architecture far more extensive than expected. It warned that the valley's map, however familiar, might still contain serious misunderstandings. That warning is more exciting than buried gold. Gold is an object. A tomb like K55 changes the scale of the question. If a structure of such size could be underestimated, what else had been flattened by assumption? What other spaces had been dismissed because they were damaged, inconvenient, or filled with debris? What had early exploration failed to imagine because it was looking for the wrong kind of prize? The modern story of K55 is often told as rediscovery, and rightly so. But it is also a story about humility. The valley had been famous for generations. It had been explored, mapped, photographed, visited, described, and mythologized. Yet a major structure associated with the sons of one of Egypt's most famous kings still had more to say. That should make every confident sentence about the valley a little more careful. KV5 also changes how we think about absence. The sons of great kings can disappear strangely easily from popular memory. A ruler like Ramesses II becomes a monument in the imagination, while the people orbiting him blur into numbers, titles, and genealogical charts. But the architecture of KV5 resists that flattening. It insists that these princes occupied space, both in life and in death. Their burials required planning. Their identities mattered enough to be placed within this sacred geography. Not every name survives clearly. Not every body can be restored to a clean biography. But the tomb's scale itself becomes testimony. It says that kingship was never only the king. Around the throne were sons who embodied continuity and competition, promise and risk. Some may have died before they could inherit. Some may have held titles and responsibilities that served their father's reign. Some may be known only in fragments. But together, they formed part of the political machinery that made Ramesses II more than a man. They made him the center of a dynasty. There is something almost overwhelming about imagining KV5 in use, not as a tourist site, not as an archaeological problem, but as a planned funerary space connected to a living royal family. The corridors and chambers were not empty concepts. They were meant to receive the dead of a house that had stretched itself across Egypt's monuments. The tomb's complexity mirrors the complexity of royal reproduction, succession, and display. And then, after all that ambition, the valley did what it so often does. It buried the evidence in disorder. Floodwater entered. Debris accumulated. Memory thinned. The monument lost the clarity its builders intended. A tomb built to preserve royal sons became, for a long time, a damaged and underestimated space. That reversal is almost cruel. But it is also the reason KV5 is so valuable. It shows us the distance between ancient intention and archaeological survival. The builders intended an enduring monument. What survived was a puzzle. The modern task was not simply to admire the original design, but to recover it from the injuries of time. Every cleared chamber, every mapped corridor, every identified fragment pulled the tomb back from simplification. KV5's drama is not the drama of opening a door and seeing gold. It is the drama of realizing, slowly, that the map in your head is too small. This is a different kind of wonder. Less cinematic at first glance, perhaps, but deeper. It is the wonder of scale emerging out of neglect. The wonder of a known site refusing to remain known. The wonder of royal family politics, written not in a palace text, but in an underground structure that expands like a buried memory. And it offers a necessary counterpoint to Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's tomb feels intimate, almost compressed. The burial of a young king packed into a relatively small space, filled with objects that survived by chance and concealment. K55 feels sprawling, collective, dynastic. One tomb draws us toward the fragile body of a boy king. The other pushes us outward toward the machinery of a royal house at full scale. Together, they show the range of the valley. It could hold a nearly intact burial that changed the modern world's image of Egypt. It could also hold a vast, damaged complex that changed the scholarly understanding of how much remained misunderstood. And this is why KV5 stands as one of the great reversals in the valley's modern story. It turned neglect into significance. It took an entrance that had not seemed especially promising and opened it into a vision of Ramesside power that was architectural, familial, and political all at once. The princes buried there were not the stars of the old treasure-hunting imagination, but they may be more important than that imagination would have known how to handle. They remind us that royal cemeteries are not only built for famous names, they are built for systems, for heirs who died too soon, for sons whose importance was real even when their stories became faint, for the continuation of a dynasty that needed to be seen, honored, and housed in death. KV5 made the valley less solitary. It filled the darkness with a family. Not a family in the sentimental modern sense, neatly arranged around affection, but a royal family as ancient power understood it, ranked, titled, strategic, sacred, and vulnerable to time. And once archaeologists began to map that complexity, the valley's surface could no longer be trusted as a simple guide to what lay beneath it. A small opening might conceal a vast design. A damaged tomb might preserve the shape of a dynasty. A neglected number on a plan might lead to one of the most ambitious underground structures ever identified there. The lesson was clear, though not comfortable. The Valley of the Kings did not give up its secrets only to those who found something new. Sometimes it gave them to those willing to admit that the old map was unfinished. To map the Valley of the Kings is to admit that the tombs are only part of the story. A visitor sees entrances. An archaeologist has to see relationships. That is a less glamorous sentence than a hidden chamber was discovered. But it may be more important. Because the valley's secrets do not exist as isolated surprises waiting politely behind doors. They exist in the way the landscape fits together. The slope of the ground, the path of floodwater, the placement of spoil heaps, the scars left by ancient workers, the distance between one entrance and another, the places where a tomb was cut confidently and the places where someone seems to have stopped. The invisible valley is not imaginary. It is the valley beneath the obvious one. It is made of elevations, measurements, blocked lines of sight, abandoned cuts, debris fans, chisel marks, workmen's paths, and the quiet geometry of royal ambition. It is what you begin to see when the place stops being a collection of famous tombs and becomes a system. And systems can be mapped, not perfectly, but carefully enough to change the questions. Early exploration often moved toward openings. That was natural. A doorway is an invitation. A shaft is a promise. A painted wall is a reward. But modern survey asks a broader question. Why is the opening here at all? Why this bend in the valley? Why this height? Why this orientation? What was nearby when the tomb was cut? What was already hidden? What might have been accidentally covered by later activity? This kind of work can feel almost invisible to the public because its discoveries are not always objects. Sometimes the discovery is a pattern, a flood path that explains why one entrance vanished, a spoil heap that suggests ancient cutting nearby, a cluster of minor features that reveals work activity, a relationship between tombs that hints at chronology, planning, or interference. A map can make the ground speak without opening a single new chamber. That may be the hardest kind of revelation to sell, because it does not glitter, but it changes everything that follows. Once the valley is mapped as a landscape rather than a treasure field, every piece of ground becomes evidence. Empty space is no longer empty. It may be unexcavated, disturbed, eroded, buried, misread, or genuinely blank, and those are very different possibilities. This is where archaeology becomes disciplined imagination, not fantasy, not guessing. Disciplined imagination, the ability to look at a slope and ask what water would do there, to look at rubble and ask whether it fell, washed, or was dumped, to look at a tomb entrance and imagine the work gangs who cut it, the officials who supervised it, the priests who later approached it, the robbers who may have tested it, and the modern excavators who cleared it with their own assumptions in hand. The valley does not allow one viewpoint. It demands layers. There is the geological layer: limestone, faults, slopes, drainage, erosion. There is the architectural layer: shafts, corridors, chambers, unfinished cuts, blocked passages. There is the human layer: workers, guards, priests, robbers, restorers, excavators. There is the political layer: which king had power, which family needed legitimacy, which memory became dangerous, which burial had to be protected or concealed. A good map cannot capture all of that by itself, but it can hold the evidence in place long enough for the relationships to become visible. And in the Valley of the Kings, relationships are often the real clues. A tomb is not only a tomb, it is a decision made in relation to other decisions. Its entrance may avoid another cutting. Its debris may cover an earlier feature. Its location may reflect practical access, ritual meaning, geology, secrecy, or some combination that cannot now be fully separated. Even the failures matter. Abandoned tombs, unfinished corridors, rough cuts that suggest a plan interrupted by death, politics, poor rock, or changed priorities. To map such things is to map uncertainty. That is not a flaw. It is honesty. A map with uncertainty is better than a story with false confidence. The valley has suffered enough from dramatic certainty. It has been called exhausted, solved, haunted, cursed, and emptied, often by people who wanted it to behave like a legend rather than a site. Systematic survey pushes back against that. It says, measure first, compare carefully. Let the ground complicate the story before the headline simplifies it. This is why modern archaeology often moves slowly in a place that the imagination wants to rush. A new crack in the rock is not automatically a tomb. A void suggested by an instrument is not automatically a queen. A disturbance in the ground is not automatically a sealed chamber. The valley contains natural cavities, damaged areas, modern interference, ancient debris, and features that can mislead even careful observers. The more famous the landscape, the more dangerous wishful thinking becomes. Because fame creates pressure, every ambiguous sign can become a rumor. Every rumor can become a theory. Every theory can become a headline before the evidence has had time to breathe. The Valley of the Kings, perhaps more than almost any archaeological landscape, has to be protected not only from erosion and tourism, but from narrative impatience. Mapping is one antidote. It slows the story down. It replaces the fever of what if with the discipline of where exactly. Where was the feature found? Where does it sit in relation to known tombs? Where would floodwater have moved? Where did ancient workmen dump their debris? Where are the old excavation trenches? Where has the ground already been disturbed? Where does the evidence end? That last question matters most. Where does the evidence end? The valley invites speculation because it is incomplete. But incompleteness is not permission to invent. It is a reason to become more careful. A measured plan, a conservation record, a topographical survey, a photographic archive. These are not background tools. They are defenses against the human appetite for a better story than the evidence can support. And yet, caution does not kill wonder. It deepens it. There is a particular kind of awe in seeing a complex landscape become legible. Not solved, but legible. The valley begins as heat and stone and numbered entrances, then the patterns emerge. The drainage channels, the old paths, the clustered tombs, the places where royal ambition pressed against bad geology, the hidden logic of labor and access, the scars of ancient excavation lying beside the scars of modern excavation. Suddenly, the valley is not still. It is moving in the mind. You can almost see teams of workers cutting into the cliffs, hauling debris, adjusting plans. You can imagine officials choosing a site with both ritual confidence and practical concern. You can see floodwater centuries later following its own brutal map. You can see priests returning after robbery, moving through a landscape they knew not as ruins, but as a sacred problem. You can see modern surveyors trying, carefully, not to impose a clean order on a place that never had one. This is why the invisible valley matters. It restores time to the ground. A tomb entrance is a point. A map turns it into a sequence. It asks what came before, what came after, what covered it, what cut through it, what lay beside it, and what pattern only appears when the whole landscape is considered at once. The most important discoveries after Tutankhamun did not all come from opening new tombs. Some came from learning how to see the space between tombs. That space held the evidence of work, of movement, of water, of reuse, of neglect, of ancient decisions that did not leave golden masks behind. And perhaps this is where the Valley of the Kings becomes most intellectually unsettling. Its emptiness is never simple. A patch of ground may be empty because nothing was ever there, or because something was destroyed, or because something remains below, or because earlier excavators cleared it badly, or because natural debris disguised its significance. The same surface can support several possibilities, and responsible archaeology must resist choosing the most exciting one too soon. The map, then, is not a treasure map in the childish sense. It does not say, dig here and find gold. It says, understand why here is different from there. That difference may lead to a tomb. It may lead to a workshop trace, a cache, a discarded tool, a flood deposit, or the absence of anything at all. But even absence, when properly recorded, helps refine the story. It narrows the unknown. It makes future certainty less careless. There is a quiet beauty in that. The valley's most famous discovery began with a hidden step. But the later science of the valley depends on many smaller steps: measuring, recording, comparing, doubting, returning. The romance does not vanish. It simply changes scale. Instead of one man peering through a hole at gold, we have teams slowly assembling the conditions under which any secret might survive at all. And that is a more mature kind of mystery. Not the fantasy that every stone conceals a king, but the recognition that every stone belongs to a history of placement, damage, and survival. By mapping the invisible valley, archaeologists learned to look for the tombs that were not obvious, the traces that were not monumental, and the evidence that had been hiding in plain sight, because no one had yet asked the landscape the right question. Then, in the 21st century, the valley did something that seemed almost impossible after Tutankhamun. It gave up a new tomb number. And for a moment, the world held its breath again. For a brief moment, KV-63 seemed to promise the impossible. A new tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Not a re-examined chamber. Not a better reading of an old plan. Not a famous tomb yielding another layer of interpretation. A new number. A new opening. A new disturbance in the mental map that many people had assumed was nearly complete. And because it came after Tutankhamun, the imagination did what imagination always does in this valley. It rushed ahead. A new tomb meant a new king. A new king meant a sealed burial. A sealed burial meant gold. The old dream woke instantly, as if it had only been sleeping under the limestone. But KV-63 did not become another Tutankhamun. That is exactly why it matters. Discovered in the 21st century, KV-63 was the first new tomb found in the Valley of the Kings since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. That fact alone gave it a kind of electric charge. The valley had been studied, surveyed, photographed, argued over, and walked by generations of archaeologists and visitors. Yet it still had space for a newly identified tomb. It still had the power to interrupt expert confidence. At first, the suspense was unavoidable. The entrance suggested something significant. The location was tantalizing. The valley's reputation did the rest. In a place where every sealed space can become a theater for expectation, KV-63 arrived already burdened by the memory of 1922. People did not merely ask what it was. They asked whether history was about to repeat itself. It was not. Inside, the evidence pointed away from an intact royal burial and toward something more unusual in a different way. A cache connected with embalming and funerary preparation. Coffins were present, but they did not contain the royal revelation the public had been trained to expect. Storage jars, materials, and the character of the deposit suggested a space tied to the processes surrounding burial rather than the final resting place of a king. For anyone hunting treasure, that could feel like a disappointment. For archaeology, it was a gift. Because KV-63 shifted attention from the spectacle of burial to the machinery behind it. A royal funeral did not begin at the sealed door of the tomb. By the time a body entered the valley for burial, a great deal had already happened. The corpse had been washed, treated, dried, wrapped, anointed, protected, named, transformed, and prepared through a blend of practical technique and sacred imagination. The objects that made that work possible were not secondary to the burial. They were part of the burial's hidden labor. KV-63 brought that labor into view. This is where the tomb becomes quietly radical. It reminds us that the golden chamber is only the final scene of a much longer production. The audience sees the coffin, the mask, the nested shrines, the ritual beauty. But behind that image lies a world of materials. Natron to dry the body, linen to wrap it, resins and oils to treat it, jars to store substances, pottery to hold what was used or left behind, and containers that could carry the residue of transformation. Immortality had supplies. That sentence cuts through the grandeur. It does not diminish the ancient belief. It makes it more real. The Egyptian afterlife was not only imagined in texts and painted in divine colors, it was made through work, through handling, through repeated procedures learned, guarded, and performed by specialists. Even the most sacred journey required inventory, and KV-63 appears to have preserved part of that practical sacred world. Not the finished king, the preparation around the king. That distinction changes the tone of discovery. Instead of standing before royal identity, we stand before ritual process. Instead of asking, "Whose body is this?" we ask, "What work was done here?" Or what work do these materials preserve evidence for? That is a less dramatic question to the casual eye, but it reaches deeper into how death was managed. It also restores importance to people who almost never receive the center of the story. The embalmers, the handlers, the priests, the workers responsible for the substances and containers that made a burial possible. Royal tombs were designed to magnify the dead ruler. KV-63 points us toward the living specialists whose labor helped create that magnification. They were not the subjects of colossal statues. They were not the names that tourists came searching for. Yet without them, the king's transformation would remain unfinished. There is a strange intimacy to an embalming cache. A royal tomb says, "Look at the completed eternity." An embalming cache says, "Look at what eternity required," and what it required was not abstract. It was material, sometimes messy, sometimes repetitive, sometimes stored away after use because even ritual leftovers could carry significance. In modern terms, we might be tempted to think of such materials as waste, but that word can be dangerous when applied too quickly to ancient religion. What remains after a sacred process may still be sacred by association. It may need to be deposited carefully, concealed, or kept within the ritual geography connected to the burial. So KV-63 asks us to rethink value. The absence of a king is not the absence of meaning. Empty coffins are not empty evidence. Jars without glittering treasure are not archaeological footnotes. A tomb without a royal body can still open a door into royal death more honestly than a chamber full of gold, because it shows the preparation rather than the performance. It shows the backstage, if we can use that word carefully, of an event ancient Egyptians would not have thought of as theater, but which certainly required staging, sequence, tools, and trained participants. The temptation is to connect KV-63 too tightly to Tutankhamun because of its location and the period associations that have been discussed around it. That temptation should be handled cautiously. A direct connection to Tutankhamun's burial needs firm evidence, needs verification. The valley is too complex, too reused, too disturbed, and too vulnerable to wishful association for proximity alone to carry the argument. Near does not always mean belonging to. That is one of the valley's harder lessons. Objects can move. Materials can be reused. Tombs can be repurposed. Deposits can relate to rituals, cleanups, later activity, or burial preparations that are not always recoverable in a simple line. The desire to attach every intriguing find to the most famous nearby king is understandable, but fame is not evidence. KV-63 deserves better than being treated as Tutankhamun's shadow. Its importance does not depend on becoming a side note to the Golden Tomb. It stands on its own as a reminder that the Valley of the Kings was also a working landscape, not just a place where finished royal bodies were hidden, but a place connected to the ongoing management of death. Preparation, storage, deposition, and cleanup all belonged to the same sacred system. That may be the most valuable correction KV63 offers. The Valley of the Kings is often imagined through endings: the end of a life, the end of a reign, the sealed end of a corridor. But KV63 points to process. It brings us into the before and around. The materials gathered, the containers filled, the ritual substances handled, the objects set aside after their role was complete. It shows that death, for a pharaoh or elite Egyptian, was not a single event. It was a sequence of transformations, and every transformation needed matter. This also changes how we look at ordinary objects. A jar is not just ceramic. It is capacity. It is storage. It is movement from one place to another. It is residue. It is the possibility of reconstructing a vanished action. Linen is not just cloth. It is touch. It is wrapping. It is concealment and protection. It is the body being remade into something ritually durable. Natron is not just a mineral. It is dryness as theology. It is chemistry serving belief. It is the desert's own power brought into the human effort to resist decay. These things do not shine like gold. They do not need to. They belong to a deeper economy of immortality. KV63 therefore sits at an important point in the valley's modern story. It arrived with the pressure of expectation and then refused to satisfy that expectation in the obvious way. It reminded archaeologists and the public that a new tomb does not have to mean a new pharaoh, and a major discovery does not have to deliver a face, a mask, or a headline-ready name. Sometimes a major discovery delivers context, and context is what turns isolated wonders into history. Without context, Tutankhamun's tomb becomes a beautiful accident. With context, it becomes part of a larger system of royal death: preparation, burial, robbery, concealment, later study, and modern interpretation. KV63 helped widen that system. It made room for the unglamorous materials that carried the sacred work forward. There is also something almost corrective about its timing. After decades of fascination with spectacular discovery, the valley offered a find that required patience from the start. It asked observers to sit with uncertainty, to study contents rather than chase names, to consider whether an apparently strange collection of coffins and jars might be telling a story about ritual practice rather than royal identity. In that sense, KV63 was not a failed Tutankhamun. It was an antidote to Tutankhamun's shadow. It taught that the valley still had surprises, but not always the surprises people wanted. It could still open, but it might open onto labor instead of luxury. It might give us the containers of embalming rather than the king embalmed. It might reveal the workbench of eternity rather than the throne room of the dead. And perhaps that is why the discovery feels so quietly powerful. Gold tells us what royalty hoped to carry into eternity. Embalming materials tell us how fragile that hope was before anyone intervened. A body had to be prepared because a body could decay. A tomb had to be sealed because a tomb could be opened. A name had to be protected because memory could be attacked. Nothing about the royal afterlife was automatic. It had to be made. It had to be defended. It had to be supplied. KV63 lets us see the supply. Not fully, not simply, but enough to change the question again. After Tutankhamun, archaeology learned not to ask only where the next king might be. After KV63, it had to ask what traces had been left by the people who made kings ready for eternity, and how much of that sacred preparation had been hiding behind objects that looked, at first glance, like leftovers. The tomb without a king had done something a royal burial could not easily do. It turned absence into evidence. At first glance, the objects associated with KV-63 can seem almost disappointing. Empty coffins, jars, linen, natron, pottery. Materials that feel like the remains of preparation rather than the event itself. Not the king, not the face, not the golden climax. Just the things left behind when the work was done, or perhaps stored because the work had not taken the form we expected. But archaeology often begins exactly there, in the disappointment. Because disappointment is sometimes just expectation refusing to adjust. KV-63 asks us to slow down and look at the materials of immortality without demanding that they become treasure in the usual sense. A coffin does not need a body inside it to matter. A jar does not need gold inside it to matter. Linen does not need to be wrapped around a famous king to matter. These things belonged to the practical and sacred economy of death. And in that economy, even the leftover could be meaningful. The ancient Egyptian burial was not a simple act of placing a dead person underground. It was a transformation. And transformation requires tools. A body had to be dried, treated, wrapped, named, protected, and ritually restored. The dead were not merely hidden from decay, they were prepared to continue. That preparation required substances that worked physically and symbolically at the same time. Natron dried the body, but it also belonged to a world of purity. Linen covered and protected, but it also remade the body into a sacred form. Oils and resins could preserve, scent, seal, and sanctify. Pottery stored what hands needed to carry from one stage to another. Nothing was merely practical, but almost nothing was merely symbolic either. That is what makes these materials so valuable to study. They sit at the meeting point of belief and technique. The embalmer's work was not just religious imagination. It had chemistry in it. It had timing. It had texture. It had the weight of wet linen, the dryness of minerals, the stickiness of resin, the careful handling of containers, and the discipline of repeated procedures. The afterlife had a material culture before it had a finished burial chamber. When we look at a golden coffin, we are seeing the polished surface of royal eternity. When we look at embalming materials, we are seeing the workshop of that eternity. Not necessarily a workshop in the modern sense of a single room with neat benches and labeled shelves, but a chain of actions, spaces, substances, and people moving a human body from death into ritual permanence. That movement was not abstract. Someone had to lift. Someone had to pour. Someone had to wrap. Someone had to tie knots, seal vessels, carry jars, remove what had been used, and decide where sacred residues should go. This is the world KV-63 brings closer. It does not give us the theatrical satisfaction of a named king lying in place. It gives us the trace of work that usually disappears behind the finished image. And in a culture that invested so much meaning in proper burial, the trace of work is not minor. It is the hidden scaffolding of the entire system. The coffins are especially intriguing because they confuse the easy categories. An empty coffin feels incomplete. It looks like an answer with the main word missing. But emptiness can happen for many reasons, and those reasons matter. A coffin might have been made for one person and never used in the expected way. It might have been stored, repurposed, stripped, moved, or included as part of a deposit whose function was not a straightforward burial. Without firm evidence, we should resist the urge to turn every empty coffin into a lost dramatic scene. The emptiness itself is the clue. It tells us that the space was not behaving like a normal, intact burial. It pushes us to ask about storage, ritual cleanup, abandoned plans, reused funerary equipment, and deposits connected to embalming rather than final entombment. It also reminds us that the valley's contents do not always fit the categories modern viewers want. Tomb, treasure, mummy, king. Sometimes the category is messier, a cache, a deposit, a gathering of things that had sacred use, practical use, or both. That is not a lesser category. It is simply less cinematic, and perhaps more honest. The jars in KV63 pull us even further into that honesty. Jars are humble objects until you realize how much of ancient life depended on them. They hold, transport, separate, preserve, conceal. They make materials manageable. In burial practice, they can become witnesses to substances that have vanished, evaporated, dried, or left only residues behind. A jar may outlive the thing it contained, but its shape, placement, seal, and contents, even traces of contents, can preserve an action. A jar can say, something was prepared here, or stored here, or brought here from somewhere else, or considered too charged, too connected to the dead, to be casually thrown away. This last possibility matters. Modern people often separate waste from sacredness quickly. Once a thing has been used, it becomes disposable. But ritual systems do not always work that way. Materials involved in transforming the dead may carry a residual importance. Used linen, embalming substances, broken containers, and related debris could require controlled deposition, not because they were beautiful, but because they had touched the dangerous border between body and eternity. So when KV63 offers jars and materials rather than a royal mummy, it may be showing us the aftercare of preparation, the handling of what remained after sacred work. That changes the emotional tone of the find. It is not a failed burial chamber. It is a chamber of aftermath. And aftermath is often where systems reveal themselves. At a royal funeral, the official message is order. The king has passed from one state to another. Ritual has done its work. The tomb has been sealed. The cosmos has been reaffirmed. Everything is presented as finished. But leftovers tell a different kind of truth. They show that order had to be made out of substances, labor, storage, and cleanup. They show the physical surplus of ritual. They show that sacred transformation was not clean in the polished museum sense. It generated materials that had to be managed. It left behind traces that were neither ordinary trash nor central display. This is where KV63 becomes almost intimate. The gold of Tutankhamun's tomb can make us feel distant from the ancient world. Its beauty is so complete that it becomes unreal. The objects seem to belong to a dream of kingship, but linen and natron bring the story back to the body, not in a crude way, and not with morbid fascination, but with the sober recognition that immortality began with vulnerability. A corpse is vulnerable. That is the fact all funerary grandeur tries to overcome. It can decay. It can be damaged. It can be mishandled. It can be forgotten. It can be separated from its name. Egyptian burial practice confronted that vulnerability with extraordinary seriousness. It did not deny the body's fragility. It worked against it, step by step, material by material, prayer by prayer. Natron is one of the clearest examples. It is not glamorous. It does not ask to be admired. But without drying, preservation fails. The body cannot become the durable sacred form the burial requires. Natron therefore belongs to both the physical and theological logic of mummification. It is a substance of dehydration, but also part of the larger campaign against disorder. The same is true of linen. Linen can seem soft, domestic, almost ordinary. Yet in burial it becomes architecture for the body. Layer upon layer, it creates a new surface, a controlled form, a protective boundary. Wrapping is not decoration. It is reconstruction. The body is being remade as something prepared for a different existence. This is why the materials of K-63 matter so much. They reveal burial not as a moment, but as a craft. And crafts depend on people. We rarely know their names. That anonymity is part of the sadness of the valley. The kings received inscriptions. The workers often left only traces. But when we study the materials of embalming, the unnamed become briefly visible through their actions. A fold, a knot, a sealed jar, a deposit of used material. These are gestures surviving without biographies. In a royal cemetery that is quietly radical, the valley was designed to exalt kings, but evidence keeps bringing back the workers. The embalmers who touched what others were forbidden or afraid to touch. The priests who understood the sequence of rites. The administrators who supplied materials. The carriers and sealers and handlers who made the royal afterlife possible without ever becoming its subject. K-63 points toward them because it is not dominated by a royal body. Its emptiness leaves room for labor to enter the story. And labor changes the meaning of immortality. It reminds us that the dead king's eternity was not achieved by status alone. Rank could command the tomb, but it could not wrap the body by itself. Theology could define the goal, but it could not fill the jars. Power could demand permanence, but permanence required technique. This is one of the great corrections offered by the quieter discoveries after Tutankhamun. They reduce the distance between royal ideology and human work. They show that the machinery of kingship included not just crowns and monuments, but storage rooms, tools, substances, damaged containers, and the careful disposal of materials no one expected to become famous. The more we look at these things, the harder it becomes to see ancient Egyptian burial as a frozen spectacle. It becomes a sequence of human actions under sacred pressure. There is also a warning here. A direct connection between K-63 and Tutankhamun's burial has often been tempting because of the wider context of the valley and the gravitational pull of Tutankhamun's fame. But any specific link should be treated with caution unless supported by firm evidence, needs verification. Similar materials, nearby location, or chronological possibility can suggest avenues of investigation, but they do not, by themselves, prove ownership or direct association. The valley is too tangled for that. Its tombs were reused. Its materials moved. Its entrances were buried and uncovered. Its chambers served purposes that could change over time. The safest interpretation is not always the dullest. Sometimes it is the only one that allows the evidence to remain evidence rather than decoration for a theory already chosen. K-63 does not need to belong to Tutankhamun to matter. That may be the most important point. Its value lies in what it reveals about burial culture itself. The preparation of the dead, the handling of embalming materials, the sacred status of objects that might otherwise be dismissed as leftovers, and the complex relationship between storage, ritual, and deposition in the valley. It tells us that royal death had an infrastructure. Not only tomb corridors and burial chambers, but supplies, containers, processes, and aftermaths. And once we recognize that infrastructure, the Valley of the Kings becomes less like a row of heroic endings and more like a working sacred landscape, a place where death was manufactured into eternity through repeated acts, a place where the invisible labor behind royal ideology left physical traces, a place where even empty coffins could become full of meaning. There is something beautifully unsettling in that reversal. The coffin without a body becomes evidence of practice. The jar without treasure becomes evidence of transformation. The linen without a famous face becomes evidence of touch. The natron without spectacle becomes evidence of belief made chemical. These are not leftovers from the real story. They are the story, seen from a lower angle, and perhaps that is why KV63 still feels important, despite refusing the fantasy that first surrounded it. It did not give the world a new golden king. It gave something quieter, a glimpse of the sacred workshop behind the golden myth, where immortality was not yet radiant, not yet sealed, not yet displayed, but still being made. Centuries after the great kings of the new kingdom had been buried, robbed, moved, studied, and misunderstood, the Valley of the Kings still had not become a dead place. That is easy to forget. The name itself encourages a narrow imagination. The Valley of the Kings, as if its meaning belonged only to the age when pharaohs cut deep corridors into the Theban rock and filled them with the equipment of royal eternity. But sacred landscapes rarely retire neatly. They are inherited, reused, reinterpreted. Their old power does not vanish just because the political world around them has changed. KV64 reminds us of that. Announced in 2012 by a University of Basel team, KV64 contained the burial of Mehmes Bastet, a woman associated with singing or priestly service during the 22nd dynasty. She was not a new kingdom king. She was not the kind of figure the valley's modern mythology had trained the public to expect. No golden boy king, no imperial conqueror, no vast dynastic complex of princes. Instead, there was a woman whose presence opened a quieter doorway into the valley's later life, and that later life matters. By the 22nd dynasty, the world that had created the great royal tombs of the new kingdom was gone. The political and religious landscape had changed. Egypt's centers of power had shifted. The old royal cemetery was already ancient, already layered with memory, damage, and reverence. To use such a place again was not a casual act. It meant stepping into a landscape dense with inherited holiness. Mehmes Bastet's burial shows that the valley was not simply abandoned after its royal age. It continued to attract meaning. That is the important correction. We often treat archaeological sites as if they have one official period of significance. A temple is from one reign. A tomb belongs to one king. A cemetery ends when the dynasty changes. But human beings do not experience sacred places that way. A place can outlive its original purpose and become powerful because of age itself. The older it becomes, the more charged it may feel. The Valley of the Kings had become a landscape of royal memory. Its cliffs had swallowed the bodies of famous rulers. Its corridors contained texts for the afterlife. Its entrances, even when stripped or buried, belonged to a geography of divine kingship. For later Egyptians, that past was not archaeological. It was ancestral, sacred, and perhaps useful. To be buried there, or to reuse a space there, was to borrow from the valley's accumulated authority. That does not mean every later burial was an attempt to imitate kingship. We should be careful. Mehmes Bastet's burial does not turn her into a hidden queen, and it does not need that kind of exaggeration. Its significance lies in something subtler. The valley remained spiritually and culturally active long after its most famous royal burials. It had a second life, and perhaps a third, carried by people who saw old sacred ground not as a closed chapter, but as a place still capable of receiving the dead. Her identity also changes the emotional register of the story. So far, the valley has been crowded with pharaohs, princes, disputed royal bodies, priests moving kings from danger, and embalmers preparing the powerful for eternity. Mehmes Bastet brings us to a different kind of presence. A named woman tied to religious performance, to song, to service within a sacred world. A singer in the dark. That phrase can become too poetic if handled carelessly, but in her case it points towards something real. Music and ritual were not decorative extras in Egyptian religion. Sacred performance could help create atmosphere, order, and divine presence. A singer or priestess occupied a role in the machinery of worship, not by carving monuments, but by using voice, body, training, and ritual participation. This is a different kind of trace than a royal cartouche. A king announces himself in stone. A singer is harder to hear after 3,000 years, and yet here she is, preserved not as a rumor, but as a burial in one of the most famous mortuary landscapes on Earth. Her presence widens the valley's human range. It reminds us that sacred history is not made only by rulers. It is maintained by people whose work supports the divine order around rulers, gods, temples, and the dead. There is something moving about that. Not sentimental, just moving. A woman whose role involved sacred sound was placed in a landscape now known to us for silence. The modern visitor walks among tomb mouths, dry paths, controlled lights, conservation barriers, and the careful hush of heritage. But her life belonged to a world where ritual had sound, voices, instruments, recitation, movement, repeated ceremonies that gave structure to belief. The tomb preserves none of that sound, but it preserves the fact that the sound mattered. KV64 also unsettles the boundary between original use and reuse. In the Valley of the Kings, reuse is sometimes treated as a secondary event, a later disturbance of the real royal story. But reuse can be historically rich in its own right. It tells us how later people understood the past, how they occupied inherited spaces, and how sacred geography could be adapted to new circumstances. A reused tomb is not merely a damaged original. It is also a record of later choice. That choice may be practical. Old tombs offered ready-made spaces. It may be sacred. The location carried prestige and religious weight. It may be both at once. As with so much in Egypt, the practical and the sacred often refuse to stay separate. This is why KV64 matters beyond the drama of discovery. It forces us to see the valley not as a monument to one age, but as a palimpsest, a surface written over without fully erasing what came before. The New Kingdom wrote one version in royal corridors and painted underworld texts. Later Egyptians wrote another in reused spaces and new burials. Modern archaeology writes yet another in numbers, reports, photographs, and cautious interpretations. Each layer changes how the earlier layers are seen. Nehemesbastet's burial does not compete with the king's. It listens beside them. Her presence says that the valley's sanctity was not locked in the past. It could be reactivated. It could be made meaningful again under different political conditions, for a different person, in a different religious landscape. The sacred geography survived its original builders, and that survival is one of the great themes of the valley. Not survival as perfect preservation, survival as adaptation. Royal mummies survived by being moved. Tomb entrances survived by being buried in flood debris. Ritual evidence survived in caches. Princes survived in damaged architecture. And here, a later woman survived in a valley whose name seems, at first, to leave little room for her. The Valley of the Kings is not a fair name if we let it become too literal. It hides the women. It hides the children. It hides the workers. It hides the priests, singers, embalmers, guards, quarrymen, inspectors, robbers, restorers, and later communities who gave the place its long human afterlife. The kings dominate the skyline of memory, but they do not occupy the whole ground. K564 is valuable because it opens that ground. It asks us to look at the valley after the Great Royal Age, not as decline alone, but as continuation through changed forms. The old tombs did not become meaningless simply because the new kingdom ended. Their meanings shifted. They became available to later acts of burial and remembrance. They carried the authority of the ancient dead into new centuries. And for Nehemiah's Bastet, that authority may have mattered. We should not pretend to know her private hopes. The evidence does not allow us to enter her mind. But her burial's location tells us that someone placed her within a landscape charged by royal and sacred memory. That decision, whether motivated by status, piety, practicality, tradition, or some mixture of all these things, made her part of the valley's extended story. Not an intrusion, a continuation. This is the more generous and more accurate way to see later burials. They are not simply clutter in a royal cemetery. They are evidence that the cemetery kept living in Egyptian imagination. The past remained useful. The dead landscape continued to offer protection, prestige, or holiness to new dead. There is a quiet reversal here. Tutankhamun's tomb became famous because it brought a king into the modern world. KV-64 matters because it brings the modern viewer back into the valley's later Egyptian world, where the old royal cemetery was already ancient, already meaningful, already available for reinterpretation. To us, Nehemiah's Bastet seems late. To her own culture, she may have been entering a place older than memory, a place where kings had passed into the West and where sacred stone still held power. That difference in perspective is essential. Archaeology often flattens time into periods: 18th dynasty, 19th dynasty, 22nd dynasty. Those labels help us think clearly, but they can also make the ancient past feel organized in a way lived time never is. People in later periods did not live inside our museum categories. They inherited ruins, names, cults, stories, and places. They made choices with the past pressing around them. K564 captures one of those choices. A later burial in an older sacred landscape. A woman connected to ritual sound, placed in a valley famous for royal silence. A reminder that the valley did not stop meaning things when the last New Kingdom royal funeral ended. And once that is understood, the story widens again. Because if the valley contains kings out of place, princes nearly forgotten, embalming materials without a king, and later burials that reawaken old sacred ground, then its history can no longer be told only through the famous rulers at its center. We have to move outward, toward the families, toward the children, toward the people whose names were not carved across colossal temples, but whose lives and deaths still occupied the royal world. And in another tomb, that wider royal family would appear not as a dynasty of monuments, but as a haunting crowd of the nearly erased. In the Valley of the Kings, fame is unevenly distributed. A few names become enormous. Tutankhamun, Ramesses, Akhenaten, Amenhotep. They rise above the landscape like monuments, even when the bodies, objects, and inscriptions are fragmentary. Around them, the public imagination builds clean stories: the boy king, the great builder, the religious revolutionary, the imperial ruler. It is not that these stories are false. It is that they are incomplete in a way fame tends to conceal, because royal power was never made of one person. It was made of households, and households leave behind more complicated traces. KV-40 brings us into that complication. The tomb has been associated with numerous individuals from the 18th dynasty royal family, including princes and princesses, along with later burials and disturbance. It is not the kind of place that offers a single heroic center. It does not give us one famous face to look at, one throne to imagine, one golden mask to reproduce endlessly on posters and museum banners. Instead, it gives us a crowd. And a crowd is harder to mythologize. That is precisely why it matters. The 18th dynasty is often told through its rulers, and understandably so. This was an age of powerful kings, royal women of unusual prominence, imperial expansion, religious transformation, and courtly drama that still attracts fascination. But behind the great names were children, siblings, secondary wives, daughters, sons, relatives whose titles mattered in life and whose memories became fragile after death. K540 helps restore that wider royal world. Not completely, not neatly, but enough to make the absence visible. The identification of numerous royal family members in connection with the tomb widened the emotional and historical frame of the valley. It reminded archaeologists that the royal cemetery did not belong only to the men who wore crowns. It belonged to a dynastic system that produced heirs, alliances, rivalries, daughters married into strategy, sons prepared for roles they might never live to fulfill, and children whose deaths were part of the palace world, even if later history barely paused for them. There is something sobering about that. A child in a royal family is never only a child in the political record. That sounds cold, but ancient courts were cold in precisely this way. Birth created possibility. A son might become an heir. A daughter might strengthen a line, hold religious title, or become part of court diplomacy. A royal child's body belonged to family grief, certainly, but also to dynastic meaning. Even in death, placement mattered. And yet, from the distance of thousands of years, those children can become almost invisible. A famous king's short life may receive endless study. A royal child's even shorter life may survive as a title, a fragment, a body, a broken object, or a name that only specialists handle with care. KV40 asks the viewer to sit with that imbalance. The forgotten children and lesser-known relatives of Dynasty 18 are not simply background figures. They were part of the biological and political web that made kingship possible. Every throne depended on reproduction. Every dynasty depended on continuity. Every royal family produced people who stood close to power without necessarily becoming power's face. That closeness could be dangerous. To be born near the throne was to be born inside expectation. It might bring privilege, but it also meant being measured by succession, legitimacy, and usefulness to the royal house. A prince who died young could alter the future simply by not surviving. A princess whose name barely remains may once have held importance within rituals, family arrangements, or palace identity that the surviving record now only hints at. This is one reason KV40 feels different from the great royal tombs. It does not pull us toward a single biography. It pulls us toward a damaged family album. A family album after fire, flood, theft, reuse, and centuries of confusion. Faces missing, names displaced, pages torn out, some captions still legible, others gone forever. That image is imperfect, of course. These were not modern families posing for memory. They were royal households embedded in structures of hierarchy and sacred ideology. But the emotional force remains. K540 forces a more crowded understanding of the valley, one in which the dead are not only monarchs arranged in history books, but relatives gathered in patterns we can only partly reconstruct. The tomb also reminds us how easily status can fade. Royal blood did not guarantee clear remembrance. That is one of the cruel surprises of archaeology. We assume that high rank protects memory. Sometimes it does. A king's monuments can preserve his name across millennia, but status depends on material survival. If a tomb is disturbed, if inscriptions are damaged, if bodies are moved or burned or scattered, if later reuse interrupts original context, then royal identity can thin into uncertainty. Power wants permanence. Evidence rarely grants it so generously. In KV40, The presence of many individuals creates both richness and difficulty. Multiple burials can preserve a broader social picture, but they also complicate interpretation. Which remains belong to the original use, which belong to later reuse, which names can be tied securely to which bodies, which identifications are strong and which remain provisional. The more crowded the tomb, the more careful the reading must become. This is where the valley pushes back against easy emotion. It would be simple to turn KV40 into a purely mournful story of forgotten children. There is truth in that mood, but not enough. The tomb is also a technical problem, a historical puzzle, and a reminder that archaeological evidence often reaches us through disturbance. A burial group is not a family portrait unless the evidence supports that arrangement. Names, titles, bones, objects, and context must be held together cautiously. The emotion is real, but it must not outrun the proof. What we can say is that KV40 broadens the Royal Cemetery's human field. It shows that the valley contained not only the grand narratives of kingship, but the quieter consequences of royal reproduction and family life. It allows the less famous members of the 18th dynasty world to press back against their own disappearance, and that changes the way we think about the word royal. Royal does not always mean monumental. It can mean a small body placed in a tomb whose later history becomes confused. It can mean a name known from a fragment. It can mean a person whose life mattered intensely in the court, but barely survived in the record. It can mean proximity to power without control over how history remembers you. That last point matters most. Most people in royal families did not get to decide their own historical shape. They were recorded according to the needs of lineage, ritual, administration, and later political memory. Some were elevated. Some were erased. Some were simply lost because the material world failed them. The valley, for all its grandeur, is full of such failures. K540 turns those failures into evidence. Not evidence that can restore every life, but evidence that can correct the scale of our attention. Instead of staring only at the pharaoh, we begin to see the court around him. Instead of imagining succession as a clean line from one crowned man to another, we see a crowded field of possible heirs, siblings, daughters, mothers, and children, whose existence shaped the dynasty even when their stories did not survive cleanly. The royal house becomes less like a statue and more like a living organism, vulnerable to birth, death, illness, rivalry, and time. That vulnerability is easy to forget in the Valley of the Kings because the architecture is so forceful. A tomb cut into rock suggests confidence. A royal title suggests order. A dynasty number suggests sequence. But family life is not orderly just because historians later number the dynasty. Children die before parents. Heirs die before succession. Marriages produce claims and complications. Religious roles elevate certain women and obscure others. A court can be full of people who matter deeply for a moment and then become nearly invisible. KV40 gives that invisibility a location. It says they were here too. The lesser-known figures of Dynasty 18 were not abstractions attached to famous kings. They had bodies, burials, titles, relationships, and deaths. The valley held them even when history did not know how to remember them properly. There is a moral adjustment in that, not a modern judgment imposed crudely on the past, but a shift in attention. Archaeology is often described as recovering the dead. In practice, it often recovers the conditions of being forgotten. KV40 does both. It brings back traces of royal relatives, while also showing how much cannot be brought back. The brokenness of the evidence becomes part of the story, not an obstacle to hide. And perhaps that is why this tomb feels so important in the long shadow after Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's discovery made one young king spectacularly visible. His face, or rather the golden face made for his eternity, became one of the most recognizable images in the world. KV-40 moves in the opposite direction. It does not concentrate memory into one icon. It disperses memory across many lives, many partial identities, many people who stood near the center and still almost vanished. One tomb gives us fame. The other gives us scale. Together, they remind us that ancient royalty was not a solitary condition. It was a network of bodies and expectations, of names protected and names lost, of children who might have become politically important had they lived longer, and women whose roles may have been essential even when later history gave them little space. The valley's emotional map changes when these figures are included. The tombs are no longer only monuments to power. They become evidence of dependence. A king depends on ancestors for legitimacy, on heirs for continuity, on wives and mothers for dynastic structure, on priests for ritual survival, on workers for burial, and on descendants, sometimes hostile descendants, for memory. No ruler, however divine in title, stands alone inside the archaeology. KV-40 makes that dependence harder to ignore. It introduces a quieter tragedy than robbed gold or disputed identity. The tragedy of being close to history and still almost erased by it. The tragedy of belonging to a royal house whose famous members survive in books, while others survive as fragments in a damaged tomb. The tragedy of children and lesser-known relatives whose importance was real, but whose stories now reach us through scattered evidence rather than narrative. And yet, the tomb is not only tragic. It is corrective. It corrects the loneliness of royal history. It corrects the obsession with kings as isolated figures. It corrects the idea that a discovery must center on a famous name to matter. It asks us to consider the royal dead not as a parade of individual rulers, but as generations, clustered, interrelated, vulnerable, and unevenly remembered. That is a deeper kind of history, less clean, more human. And in the Valley of the Kings, the human story was always larger than the royal one, because for every famous tomb cut for a pharaoh, there were smaller traces of the world that made such burials possible. Pits, caches, workmen's marks, minor tombs, discarded tools, fragments of food, pottery, rope, ceiling material, paths worn by feet that did not belong to kings. The valley was built for royal eternity, but it was made by people who had to live in time. The Valley of the Kings was built to make kings eternal, but eternity, in practice, depended on people who were not kings. That is the uncomfortable correction hidden in the smaller traces of the valley. The grand tombs dominate the eye because they were designed to dominate it. They pull us toward painted chambers, royal names, sacred texts, and the long descent of a pharaoh into the next world. But around those monuments existed a whole working system, mostly less visible, without which the royal afterlife could not function at all. A royal tomb did not cut itself. A mummy did not wrap itself. A sealed doorway did not seal itself. Even divine kingship required payroll, tools, timing, supervision, and tired hands. This is where minor tombs, pits, caches, fragments, and workmen's traces become unexpectedly powerful. They shift the valley away from the polished language of monarchy and toward the machinery that supported it. A small find may not make a museum poster. It may never become famous, but it can reveal the hidden infrastructure behind eternal kingship more honestly than a masterpiece. A pit can tell us about storage. A cache can tell us about ritual disposal. A rough mark can tell us about labor. A fragment of pottery can tell us about movement, provisioning, or dating. A small tomb can show how the royal cemetery was used by people who stood near power without becoming its center. These are not side details. They are the operating system. The old treasure-hunting imagination would have passed over much of this too quickly. It wanted sealed chambers, royal names, and objects that announced their importance in precious materials. But archaeology has learned, sometimes painfully, that modest evidence can be more instructive than spectacular evidence. A golden object may tell us what elites valued. A broken ordinary object may tell us how the system worked. And systems are often hidden in the ordinary. Think of the valley not at the moment of discovery, but at the moment of construction. The air is not yet filled with museum silence. It is filled with sound, hammering, orders, footsteps, tools biting into rock, men hauling debris out from a tomb cut, officials checking progress, artists preparing surfaces, supplies arriving from outside the valley. The royal tomb, which later seems like a sacred secret, begins as a noisy workplace. That is easy to forget because finished monuments conceal labor. They are meant to. A completed tomb presents order. It does not usually advertise the missed deadlines, the bad stone, the revised plans, the administrative pressure, the workers who made mistakes, the supervisors who corrected them, or the fear that the king might die before the tomb was ready. But traces of that working world remain if we look at the less glamorous evidence. Tool marks matter. So do quarry scars. So do rough surfaces where finish was never completed. So do paths, huts, ostraca, spoil heaps, and discarded material. They tell us that the Valley of the Kings was not merely a sacred zone. It was a managed construction landscape. The dead king's eternity began with very earthly problems. Where to cut, how fast to work, how to move stone, how to supply labor, how to protect the site, how to maintain secrecy while employing the people required to build the secret. Secrecy itself had logistics. That is a revealing paradox. A royal tomb was meant to be hidden, but it took a community of workers to create it. The more elaborate the tomb, the more people had to know at least something about it. Guards, craftsmen, administrators, priests, and suppliers all became part of a system that depended on controlled knowledge. The valley's security was never simply architectural. It was social. And social systems leak. They leak through corruption, through memory, through poverty, through political collapse, through the ordinary fact that human beings talk, remember, bargain, and survive. A tomb hidden in rock could be betrayed by the world outside it. That is why the smaller traces of the valley matter. They show the human network that both protected and endangered the royal dead. The workers were essential. They were also potential points of vulnerability. That does not mean we should imagine every laborer as a future robber, or every official as corrupt. That would be lazy. The valley's history is more interesting than suspicion alone. Many people clearly took the rituals and responsibilities of burial seriously. The work required skill, discipline, and belief. But the same system that produced sacred protection also produced knowledge of where valuables lay. The royal cemetery was never protected by stone alone. It was protected by trust, and trust is harder to preserve than limestone. Minor finds help us see that tension. A seal impression may suggest administrative control. A workman's mark may suggest organization. A cache may suggest careful disposal of ritual materials. A small, intrusive burial may suggest later reuse of sacred space. A pit may reveal storage, clearance, or activity connected to the preparation and maintenance of tombs. Each one is a small opening into the valley's human management. These discoveries also challenge the way we rank importance. Modern viewers often inherit the hierarchy created by ancient power. Kings at the top, then queens, then princes, then officials, then everyone else, fading into anonymous labor. But archaeology can disturb that hierarchy. A worker's trace may explain a royal tomb more effectively than another royal title. A cache of materials may reveal more about burial practice than a damaged inscription. A minor feature may clarify how people moved through the valley, where they worked, what they carried, and how sacred space was organized. The small thing can become the key. That is one of the great pleasures of careful archaeology. It allows importance to emerge from evidence rather than status. A piece of pottery does not know it is humble. A rope fragment does not know it lacks glamour. A rough mark on stone does not apologize for not being a cartouche. These things simply remain, and because they remain, they can correct the story. They remind us that ancient Egypt was not built only by ideology. It was built by work. And work has habits. Where people work, they leave patterns. They create paths. They drop things. They reuse containers. They store materials. They mark surfaces. They make repairs. They abandon plans. They leave behind the small disorder that proves life was actually happening. The Valley of the Kings, seen through its minor evidence, becomes less like a silent necropolis and more like a place under constant negotiation. Sacred, yes. Restricted, yes. But not empty. It had schedules, access routes, guarded areas, supply chains, cleanup practices, and later interventions. The royal dead may have been the purpose, but the living were the mechanism. This changes the emotional center of the valley. Instead of seeing only kings descending into eternity, we begin to see the people walking back out. The stonecutter leaving the tomb after a day underground. The painter whose line disappears beneath later damage. The priest carrying materials whose sacred role ended in a deposit. The guard watching an entrance that time would eventually bury anyway. The administrator recording supplies that would never be admired in a museum case. The embalmer handling substances whose smell and texture are lost to us, but whose containers remain. None of them becomes the hero of the valley in the old sense. But without them, there is no valley as we know it. Royal immortality was collective labor disguised as individual glory. That may be the most important truth the smaller finds reveal. A king's tomb presents the afterlife as a personal destiny. The pharaoh travels, transforms, joins the divine realm, and survives by name and body. But the archaeological record shows that this personal destiny depended on an entire community of action. The body was prepared by specialists. The tomb was cut by workers. The goods were supplied by administrators. The rites were spoken by priests. The entrance was sealed by hands whose names the king's texts often do not preserve. The afterlife was royal in meaning, but communal in production. This does not make it less sacred. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. It shows a society investing enormous coordinated effort into the survival of one person, because that person represented more than himself. The king's eternity was bound to cosmic order, political legitimacy, and the continuity of the world as Egyptians understood it. To prepare the king was to participate in a system that reached far beyond ordinary labor. Still, participation did not guarantee remembrance. The workers' traces survive more often than their stories. That gap is where the valley becomes human again. The people who made eternity possible were themselves not granted the same monumental survival. Their marks remain in pieces, sometimes anonymous, sometimes incidental. Archaeology must approach them indirectly, through the physical consequences of their work. A small tomb, a pit, a cache, a line scratched into stone. A jar left behind after its contents mattered more than the container. These are not interruptions to the royal story. They are the royal story seen from below. And from below, the valley looks different. The great tombs no longer appear as isolated works of genius or faith. They appear as the visible tips of a much broader organization. Villages, crews, rations, tools, workshops, priests, guards, supply routes, and decisions made under pressure. The valley becomes a sacred workplace where the boundary between devotion and administration is almost impossible to draw. That boundary may not have existed in the way we imagine it. Modern people often divide bureaucracy from belief. Forms and supplies on one side, ritual and meaning on the other. Ancient burial collapses that division. Administration made ritual possible. The correct materials had to arrive. The correct people had to perform the correct actions. The correct spaces had to be prepared. A missing supply was not merely an inconvenience. It could threaten the proper completion of sacred work. In that sense, logistics were theological. The small finds teach this better than the grand objects do. A golden shrine tells us that the king was magnificent. A storage jar tells us that magnificence had to be organized. A royal coffin tells us that the dead were transformed. Natron and linen tell us that transformation required substances, sequence, and skill. A decorated wall tells us what the afterlife was supposed to look like. A rough work trace tells us how much human effort stood between belief and completion. There is no need to romanticize these traces. They are not dramatic in the usual sense. They do not reveal a hidden queen or a lost treasure. They do something more patient. They thicken reality. They make the valley feel inhabited by more than royal ghosts and modern theories. They fill it with labor. And labor is history's most persistent shadow. Not the theatrical kind. The practical kind. The kind that follows every monument and asks who carried the stone, who mixed the plaster, who cleaned the chamber, who replaced the broken tool, who checked the seal, who swept away the chips, who returned after a flood, who decided which debris was meaningless and which had to be kept. Some of those decisions are still visible. Others were lost the moment they were made. But the surviving minor evidence gives archaeology a way to resist the distortions of grandeur. It reminds us that the valley's meaning was produced by a whole society, not simply declared by kings. The pharaoh may have occupied the center of the tomb, but he did not occupy the whole process. This is why small tombs and modest finds can carry larger truths. They reveal the valley as an ecosystem of death. Royal bodies at the center. Workers around them, priests maintaining ritual, officials managing access, robbers exploiting weakness, nature altering everything, later generations reusing what remained, modern archaeologists trying to disentangle all of it without mistaking the loudest evidence for the most important. The Valley of the Kings, then, is not only a place where Egypt buried power, it is a place where power depended on everyone it overshadowed. That realization changes how we move through the story. The next great secret may not be a chamber glittering with untouched treasure. It may be a minor feature that explains a major pattern. It may be a cache that clarifies a ritual. It may be an unfinished cut that reveals a change in plan. It may be a small, damaged tomb that shifts our understanding of who was allowed into the sacred landscape and why. The map remains unfinished, not because archaeologists have failed to look, but because the valley is made of layers that do not reveal themselves all at once. Some secrets are royal, some are geological, some are administrative, some are almost embarrassingly ordinary. And the ordinary ones may be the most truthful, because they show the valley not as a mythic chamber of kings, but as a place where human beings tried, with tools and faith and imperfect systems, to make death obey order. That effort was never complete. It could be damaged by robbers, confused by reuse, buried by floods, and revised by later hands. But the traces remain, scattered across tombs, pits, caches, and workmen's marks, waiting for someone to take them seriously. The real treasure, by now, is not the object that shines. It is the pattern that finally becomes visible. Even now, the map of the Valley of the Kings should not be spoken of as finished. That does not mean we should imagine a golden pharaoh under every unexcavated patch of ground. The valley has suffered enough from that kind of hunger. But caution is not the same as closure. A landscape can be heavily studied and still retain unresolved edges. It can be famous, numbered, surveyed, and visited by millions, and still contain places where the evidence is too thin, too recent, too disputed, or too poorly understood for certainty. This is where reports of more recent discoveries, including Kf 65 in the Western Valley, enter the story. Carefully. Very carefully. The Western Valley has always carried a slightly different mood from the main valley. It feels less crowded in the imagination, less dominated by the parade of familiar names. Yet it belongs to the same sacred geography, the same larger world of royal burial, concealment, and memory. A new tomb number there is not a small thing. It suggests that even in the 21st century, the ancient map can still shift. But a tomb number is not the same as an answer. That distinction matters. Kv 65 has been described in connection with recent exploration in the Western Valley. But details about its date, function, ownership, and full archaeological meaning remain needs verification, where publicly available evidence is limited, developing, or disputed. It would be irresponsible to present it as a solved royal tomb. It would be even more irresponsible to attach a famous name simply because famous names attract attention. The valley does not need another invented certainty. It needs patience, and patience is harder than excitement. A newly identified feature in the Valley of the Kings immediately enters a storm of expectation. The public wants to know whose tomb it is. Media wants a headline. Enthusiasts want a lost queen, a missing king, a sealed chamber, a final great revelation. Even careful archaeologists work under the pressure of a place where every announcement echoes Tutankhamun, whether anyone wants it to or not. That echo can distort the first hearing, because not every tomb is royal in the way the public imagines. Not every tomb was finished. Not every tomb held a burial. Not every burial remained in place. Not every chamber has a name. And not every discovery should be forced into a dramatic story before the evidence is ready. This is the lesson the Valley has been teaching again and again. Kv 55 warns us that identity can remain disputed even when the body is present. Kv 63 warns us that a new tomb can be more about ritual materials than a buried ruler. Kv 64 warns us that later use can matter as much as original royal intention. Kv 5 warns us that a known place can be misunderstood for generations. And the smaller traces remind us that the most important evidence may not look important at first. Kv 65, approached cautiously, belongs to that unfinished pattern. Its significance may eventually prove architectural, chronological, ritual, or simply corrective. It may help clarify activity in the Western Valley. It may turn out to be modest. It may become more important as future work places it in relation to surrounding features. At this stage, where details remain, needs verification. The honest statement is not, "Here is what it proves." The honest statement is, "The map is still alive." That may sound poetic, but it is also practical. Archaeological maps are not just drawings of where things are. They are records of what is known, what is assumed, what has been checked, what has been damaged, and what remains open. Every new tomb number adjusts that record. It creates a new point of comparison. It forces old measurements, old expectations, and old narratives to make room. The danger is that we ask too much of it too quickly. The Valley of the Kings has a way of turning uncertainty into spectacle. A void becomes a chamber becomes a tomb becomes a queen, A queen becomes a headline. By the time the evidence catches up, the story has already traveled farther than the facts. That is not archaeology. That is desire wearing a field hat. Real archaeology must move more slowly, especially in a place this charged. It has to ask plain questions before grand ones. What exactly was found? Was it cut by human hands or formed naturally? Is it a tomb, a shaft, a chamber, an unfinished cutting, a cache, a later intrusion, or something else? What material evidence exists inside? Is there pottery, organic material, inscriptions, tool marks, flood deposits? Is the context secure? Has the feature been disturbed? What comparisons can be made with other sites in the valley? Only after those questions begin to settle should ownership be discussed. And even then, with restraint. Because ownership in the Valley of the Kings is not always straightforward. A tomb may have been cut for one person and used by another. It may have been started and abandoned. It may have been reused centuries later. Objects found inside may have moved from elsewhere. A name on an object may not name the tomb's owner. Absence of a name may not mean absence of importance. The valley punishes shortcuts. It has done so for more than a century. Still, there is genuine excitement in the idea of KV65 if we let the excitement remain disciplined. The discovery of any new feature in the royal necropolis reminds us that modern certainty is temporary. The ground has not signed an agreement with our maps. The numbering system may give an impression of order, but the valley itself is older, rougher, and less cooperative than any catalog. A number is a handle, not a conclusion. This is especially important in the Western Valley, where the relationship between known royal burials, unfinished projects, and lesser understood features may still hold questions about planning and royal choice. Why was one area preferred over another at a given moment? How did geology influence selection? What routes did workers use? What did ancient officials know about nearby cuttings? How did later disturbance reshape the evidence? A modest discovery can help answer such questions without ever producing a spectacular owner. That is the mature way to value it. If KV65 eventually reveals more, it should be allowed to reveal it through evidence, not through the gravitational pull of famous names. If it remains obscure, that obscurity is still useful. Not every blank on a map hides a legend. Sometimes it preserves the limits of what we can responsibly say. And those limits are not failures. They are part of the truth. The Valley of the Kings is powerful partly because it resists completion. It contains known tombs with unknown histories, famous bodies with disputed identities, empty spaces that may mean nothing, and small features that may explain more than expected. Its archaeology is not a straight road from darkness into certainty. It is a long negotiation with fragments. KV65, then, should be treated as a reminder rather than a revelation. A reminder that new finds can still happen. A reminder that every announcement should be separated from every assumption. A reminder that the valley's future discoveries may not satisfy the old hunger for treasure, but may still deepen the historical record. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that mystery is not the same as permission. Mystery should make us more careful, not less. There is a kind of honesty in leaving a tomb partly unresolved. It allows the viewer to feel the true shape of archaeological knowledge, not a pile of answers, but a field of evidence with stronger and weaker points, clear areas and uncertain edges. The strongest stories are not always the ones that claim the most. Sometimes they are the ones that know where to stop. For a channel like this, that restraint matters, because the valley is already dark enough, strange enough, human enough. It does not need false discoveries added to it. A cautious unknown can be more haunting than a fabricated certainty. The thought that a feature exists, but its date, purpose, and owner remain needs verification, is not dull. It is the real suspense of archaeology. It means the past has not yet agreed to be summarized. The unfinished map also changes how we look backward. Every great discovery was once an uncertainty. Every famous tomb was once just a place in the ground before it became a name in history. But the reverse is also true. Every uncertain place does not become great. Some remain minor. Some remain ambiguous. Some become important only because they help prove what is not there. That too is knowledge. A valley mapped honestly includes both discoveries and disappointments. It includes the features that glow under attention and the features that simply tighten the grid. It includes evidence that opens questions and evidence that closes false ones. It includes the humility to say, needs verification, when the story is not ready to bear more weight. And if we are honest, that humility makes the Valley of the Kings more compelling. A completely solved valley would be a museum of conclusions. The real valley is stranger, a studied landscape that still contains uncertainty, a famous cemetery whose edges continue to resist simplification, a place where modern instruments and ancient stone keep producing conversations rather than final declarations. So KV65 stands for now less as a dramatic answer than as a marker of incompletion, a new point on an old map, a warning against impatience, a small opening in the confidence of the present. And beyond it lies one of the most famous, unresolved possibilities in modern Egyptology, a possibility that has pulled cameras, radar equipment, scholars, skeptics, and dreamers back toward the golden tomb of Tutankhamun, all searching for a woman whose absence may be more powerful than many kings' monuments. The shadow of Nefertiti falls across the Valley of the Kings in a peculiar way, not as a tomb, not as a body, not as a confirmed discovery, as a possibility. And possibilities, in archaeology, can be dangerous when they become famous before they become proven. Nefertiti is one of the most recognizable figures from ancient Egypt, but recognition is not the same as knowledge. Her face, or at least the famous sculpted image associated with her, has become almost modern in its familiarity. Elegant, composed, remote. A queen turned into an icon of beauty, power, and unresolved absence. But icons simplify people. Nefertiti was not only a face. She was a royal woman of the Amarna period, deeply connected to Akhenaten's court and religious transformation. Her historical role was significant, but the end of her life remains wrapped in uncertainty. Where she died, how she was buried, whether her burial survived, and whether she was moved or erased by later political shifts, these questions have drawn scholars and the public into a long argument where evidence, hope, and fame are not always easy to separate. The most dramatic modern claim has centered on Tutankhamun's tomb. Could there be hidden chambers behind its walls? Could one of them contain Nefertiti? Could the most famous tomb in the valley be only the front room of a much larger royal secret? It is not hard to understand why the idea captured attention. Tutankhamun's burial chamber is already surrounded by the aura of impossible survival. The thought that something even older, even more politically charged, might lie behind its painted walls feels almost irresistible. It joins two mysteries into one: the Golden Boy King and the missing Queen of Amarna. It offers the kind of story that seems made for headlines. But archaeology cannot be guided by how satisfying a story feels. That is the problem. Radar surveys, visual analysis, architectural theories, and expert debate have all circled this possibility. At different moments, claims and counterclaims have appeared, signs that might suggest hidden spaces. Later studies that challenged those readings. interpretations that looked promising, and skepticism that forced the evidence back under pressure. The result is not a clean revelation, but a cautionary case study in how modern archaeology works under the heat of public desire. Any claim that Nefertiti's tomb has been found must be marked. Any claim that it lies behind Tutankhamun's burial chamber must also be marked. That is not a lack of imagination. It is respect for the evidence. The Valley of the Kings has trained us by now to recognize this pattern. A feature appears. A possibility forms. The possibility gathers emotional force. Soon, people begin speaking as though the most exciting interpretation is the most likely one. But the valley is full of traps for that kind of thinking. Walls can mislead. Voids can be natural or structural. Later repairs can look suggestive. Ancient alterations can invite modern overreading. Instruments can detect anomalies that require careful interpretation, not instant naming. A hidden space is not automatically a tomb. A tomb is not automatically royal. A royal tomb is not automatically Nefertiti. And Nefertiti, of all names, is too powerful to be used casually. Her fame bends the imagination around her. She has become the perfect missing person, well known enough to fascinate the public, uncertain enough to invite speculation, and connected to a period already thick with religious upheaval, erased names, family questions, and disputed bodies. In a different landscape, her missing burial would still matter. In the Valley of the Kings, it becomes explosive. Because the valley does not merely preserve bodies, it preserves absences. KV 55 preserves a damaged and disputed identity from the Amarna world. Tutankhamun preserves a young king whose family and political inheritance remain entangled with that same crisis. Nefertiti's missing burial floats between them like a question the evidence has not yet allowed us to answer. This is why the theory of hidden chambers behind Tutankhamun's tomb became so compelling. It seemed to offer a way to connect fragments into a single elegant solution. The young king's tomb, perhaps adapted from another plan. A queen hidden beyond. The Amarna family crisis sealed into the valley's most famous discovery. But elegant solutions can be wrong. History is under no obligation to arrange itself beautifully for us. The truth may be less dramatic. Nefertiti may have been buried elsewhere. Her tomb may have been destroyed. Her remains may have been moved. She may have taken on a later royal identity or role that complicates how we search for her. The evidence does not currently allow a simple, final answer, and any responsible narration must let that uncertainty stand. There is a strange dignity in that. Not every mystery improves when solved too quickly. Some mysteries teach us by resisting the shape we want to give them. Nefertiti's absence forces archaeology to confront the limits of fame as a guide. She is famous now, but ancient memory worked differently. Later rulers may have had reasons to suppress, revise, or ignore aspects of the Amarna past. Royal women, even powerful ones, could be remembered unevenly. A queen's modern iconic status does not guarantee that her burial was preserved, honored, or placed where we hope it was. Modern fame can create ancient expectations that the evidence cannot support. That is one of the quieter dangers in this story. We want Nefertiti's tomb to be extraordinary, because Nefertiti has become extraordinary to us. But archaeology must ask what was likely in her own historical context, not what would satisfy the modern eye. Her burial would have been shaped by politics, religion, family, timing, and the aftermath of the Amarna period. It may have been affected by the same forces that damaged identities, moved bodies, altered coffins, and made KV 55 such a difficult tomb to interpret. If she was buried in the royal tradition, that burial did not exist in a vacuum. It belonged to a moment when the royal family's relationship to traditional religion was unstable, when later regimes had reasons to distance themselves from Amarna, and when names and images could become politically dangerous. A burial from that world might have been protected, adapted, erased, moved, or lost. Each possibility carries weight. None should be chosen merely because it is the most cinematic. The radar debates around Tutankhamun's tomb also reveal something about modern archaeology itself. Technology can extend perception, but it cannot remove interpretation. A scan does not speak in full sentences. It produces signals, patterns, anomalies, probabilities. Human beings then decide what those might mean. Those decisions can be shaped by expertise, but also by expectation. In a place like Tutankhamun's tomb, expectation is almost impossible to silence. The walls are not just walls. They are the most famous walls in Egyptology. Every reading of them enters a room already crowded with myth. That is why skepticism is not the enemy of discovery. It is one of discovery's safeguards. Without skepticism, every anomaly becomes a revelation, and every hopeful theory becomes almost impossible to retract. With skepticism, the story moves more slowly, but it has a better chance of remaining true. And truth, in the Valley of the Kings, is already dramatic enough. We do not need to pretend that Nefertiti has been found to understand why she matters. Her absence illuminates the valley's central themes: disrupted memory, political reversal, royal family uncertainty, the limits of burial evidence, and the modern hunger to make the past complete. She is not only a missing queen, she is a test of how we behave when the evidence does not give us what we want. That test is important, because the Valley of the Kings has always attracted two kinds of search. One search looks for objects. The other looks for meaning. The first can be powerful, but it becomes reckless when it demands a prize. The second is slower. It asks what uncertainty itself reveals. Why does this missing person matter so much? What does the debate expose about Amarna history? Why are we so eager to locate her behind Tutankhamun? What would such a discovery solve? And what would it merely make more complicated? A confirmed tomb of Nefertiti would be one of the great archaeological events of modern times. But an unconfirmed possibility should remain an unconfirmed possibility. That restraint does not weaken the mystery. It sharpens it. The most haunting version of the Nefertiti question is not a hidden chamber confidently announced before proof. It is the unresolved tension between a queen whose image survived with extraordinary force and a burial history that refuses to become visible. Her face is everywhere. Her tomb is nowhere certain. That contrast is more powerful than any premature claim. It reminds us that survival is uneven. A sculpted image can outlive a body. A modern icon can emerge from an ancient political crisis. A queen can become globally famous while the facts of her death remain fragile, disputed, or lost. The past is not a fair system of memory. It preserves what it preserves, and sometimes the most vivid person in the imagination leaves the most elusive trace in the ground. So we return to Tutankhamun's tomb with caution, not as a sealed promise, not as a confirmed doorway to Nefertiti, but as a place where the desire for another revelation has gathered around walls already heavy with history. The possibility remains. The debate remains instructive. The evidence must remain in command. And if nothing lies behind those walls, or nothing that matches the dream, the story does not collapse. It simply becomes more honest. Nefertiti's shadow would still remain over the valley. Not because she has been found, but because her absence reveals how much of ancient royal history survives as pressure rather than proof. Pressure on names, pressure on walls, pressure on scholars, pressure on the public imagination. The missing queen has become part of the valley's modern landscape. a figure not buried in certainty, but suspended between evidence and longing, and perhaps that is where she belongs for now. Not as a solved secret, not as a headline waiting to be confirmed, but as a reminder that the Valley of the Kings is at its most dangerous when it tells us exactly the story we were hoping to hear. The better approach is slower. Let the instruments measure. Let the walls remain walls until evidence says otherwise. Let the queen remain missing rather than falsely found. Because in this valley, an honest uncertainty is worth more than a golden rumor. By now, the golden coffin has begun to look different. Not less beautiful, not less important, just less alone. Tutankhamun's tomb will always hold its place in the story of archaeology because it gave the modern world something almost impossible. A royal burial rich enough to make ancient kingship feel suddenly visible. It had the force of revelation. Even now, a century later, its objects still carry that first shock of survival. Gold has a way of making time seem defeated. But the deeper lesson of the Valley of the Kings is that time was not defeated. It was negotiated. That is what the discoveries after Tutankhamun teach us. Again and again, they pull the story away from the simple fantasy of untouched treasure and towards something more complicated. Ritual, damage, rescue, reuse, concealment, family, labor, geology, and uncertainty. They show that the real history of the valley is not a row of sealed royal endings. It is a long sequence of human attempts to protect meaning against everything that threatened it. Gold was only one language of that effort. There were others. A moved mummy speaks one language. An altered coffin speaks another. An embalming cache speaks in jars, linen, natron, and residue. A reused tomb speaks through interruption. A minor pit speaks through context. A flood deposit speaks through mud and stone. A disputed body speaks through the uncomfortable fact that even royal identity can become unstable when politics changes and evidence breaks. Together, these discoveries change the valley from a treasure landscape into a historical landscape. That may sound like a quiet transformation, but it is enormous. Treasure hunting asks, what did they bury? Archaeology asks, what happened here before and after the burial, and how do we know? That second question is harder. It is also more honest. The Valley of the Kings was never just about death. It was about control. Control over the body. Control over memory. Control over the royal name. Control over sacred space. Control over the dangerous transition between a king who had ruled in life and a being who was expected to continue in eternity. But control failed often enough to leave evidence. Robbers entered. Priests returned. Bodies were moved. Objects were stripped. Names were damaged. Tombs were reused. Floods carried debris into sacred architecture. Later generations treated old royal spaces not as closed museum pieces, but as places still charged with usefulness and power. That is the valley's true archive. Not perfection, intervention. The old romantic story wants the tomb to remain sealed until the archaeologist arrives. It wants a straight line from ancient funeral to modern discovery. It wants the past to wait politely, untouched, until someone worthy opens the door. But the Valley of the Kings rarely behaved that way. It was entered by the ancient living long before it was entered by modern investigators. It was changed by fear, theft, devotion, restoration, and necessity. The people who disturbed the tombs were not all villains. Some were thieves, yes. Some were protectors. Some were officials managing damage. Some were later Egyptians reusing a landscape they still considered sacred. Some were modern excavators working with methods their successors would judge unevenly. The valley is not a clean crime scene. It is a crowded record of return. That is why the discoveries after Tutankhamun matter so much. They did not merely add more facts. They changed the kind of story that could be told. KV-55 forced the question of political memory and the damaged aftermath of Amarna. KV-35 revealed that royal mummies could become displaced survivors, hidden by later hands when their own tombs no longer protected them. Floods showed that nature itself could damage and preserve in the same gesture. KV-5 expanded the royal cemetery into a dynastic architecture of sons and succession. KV-63 turned absence into evidence and made the materials of embalming central rather than secondary. KV-64 proved that the valley's sacred life extended beyond the age that gave it its name. KV-40 brought forward royal children and lesser-known family members nearly swallowed by historical scale. And the smaller traces, the pits, caches, marks, fragments, and workmen's evidence, reminded us that kingship was not built by kings alone. That may be the most important correction of all. Ancient Egypt's royal ideology placed the pharaoh at the center of cosmic order. The tombs echo that ideology. Their corridors are designed around the king's transformation. Their texts protect his passage. Their architecture directs attention toward his eternal identity. But archaeology keeps widening the frame. It says, look at the embalmers. Look at the priests. Look at the workers cutting stone. Look at the administrators moving supplies. Look at the guards, the robbers, the restorers, the later families, the women, the children, the unnamed hands. Look at the floodwater. Look at the debris. Look at what was broken, moved, reused, and misunderstood. The result is not less majestic. It is more human. A golden mask can make a pharaoh seem almost beyond reach. A jar of embalming material brings the body back into the room. A displaced mummy reminds us that even the most sacred dead could become vulnerable. A reused coffin reveals that objects had lives after their first purpose. A royal child in a crowded tomb tells us that dynastic history was made not only by reigns, but by births and deaths that changed possibilities before they became headlines. This is where the meaning of treasure finally changes. The real treasure was never only gold. Gold is evidence, of course. It tells us about wealth, artistry, theology, power, and royal display. It deserves attention. But gold can also seduce the eye so completely that everything around it becomes background. The later discoveries correct that imbalance. They teach us that a damaged object can be more revealing than a perfect one, that a broken context can preserve the story of a crisis, that an undecorated chamber can alter what we understand about ritual practice. The most valuable discoveries are not always the most beautiful. They are the ones that change the questions. And after Tutankhamun, the questions became deeper. How did Egyptians respond when tomb security failed? How did political crisis reshape the treatment of royal bodies? How long did sacred landscapes remain active after their original age? How did royal families, not just individual kings, occupy the valley? How did natural forces determine what survived? How did modern expectation distort interpretation? And how much of ancient history survives only because someone, somewhere, made an imperfect decision under pressure? That last question lingers. Because the Valley of the Kings is full of imperfect decisions. A priest moving a mummy from its original tomb may have damaged context, but saved the body. A later burial in an older tomb may have confused the original archaeology, but preserved evidence of continued sacred use. Flood debris may have destroyed one feature and concealed another. A damaged coffin may frustrate identification, but reveal a struggle over memory. Even modern excavation, with all its ambition and flaws, became part of the valley's continuing history. There is no untouched past here, only a past touched many times. that does not make the evidence useless. It makes it alive in the historical sense, layered, altered, resistant, full of consequences. The task is not to peel away every later layer, as if only the first moment mattered. The task is to understand how the layers interact. A tomb's original purpose matters. So does its robbery. So does its reuse. So does its rediscovery. So does the modern story built around it. The valley's history did not end when a tomb was sealed. In many cases, that was only the beginning of the evidence. This is why the post-Tutankhamun discoveries changed archaeology itself. They encouraged a different kind of attention, less hungry for spectacle, more interested in systems, more cautious with claims, more willing to treat uncertainty as part of the record rather than an embarrassment to be hidden. They helped move the conversation from what treasure remains to what relationships can be reconstructed. Relationships between tombs, between bodies and coffins, between kings and families, between ritual and materials, between geology and preservation, between ancient intention and later interference, between modern technology and human interpretation. That network of relationships is far richer than a simple inventory of objects. It allows us to see the Valley of the Kings not as a place of isolated wonders, but as a landscape where power tried to become eternal and kept being pulled back into history. And history is less obedient than eternity. That may be the valley's deepest truth. The pharaohs built for forever, but forever had to pass through weather, politics, labor, greed, devotion, neglect, and rediscovery. It had to survive the failure of guards, the ambitions of later rulers, the hunger of thieves, the judgment of priests, the violence of floods, and the curiosity of modern researchers. Eternity, in the valley, was never a static condition. It was something repeatedly threatened and repeatedly repaired. That makes the place darker, perhaps, but also more moving, because the royal dead were not preserved by grandeur alone. They survived through accidents, compromises, and acts of care that were sometimes desperate and sometimes anonymous. A king might be remembered because gold remained. Another might be remembered because priests hid his body. A woman might return to history because a later burial reused sacred ground. A child might become visible because a damaged tomb preserved enough evidence to restore a fragment of the royal family. These are not clean victories over time. They are partial rescues. And partial rescues are often the most honest kind archaeology can offer. So when we look back at Tutankhamun's golden coffin, we should not see it as the final secret of the valley. We should see it as the brightest doorway into a much larger darkness. Not darkness as fantasy, but darkness as the unknown depth of human history. Behind the gold were embalmers and priests. Around the tomb were floods and debris. Nearby were disputed bodies, reused spaces, unfinished maps, missing queens, forgotten children, and royal sons in corridors that took generations to understand. The valley did not become less mysterious after Tutankhamun. It became less simple. And that is better. A simple mystery can be solved and put away. A deeper mystery changes how we think. The Valley of the Kings asks us to give up the childish hope that the past will present itself as a single sealed room full of answers. It asks us to accept something more difficult and more rewarding. That history survives in fragments, and those fragments must be treated with patience. Gold made the world look, but the fragments made archaeology listen. And once you hear them, the valley is no longer just the place where Egypt buried its kings. It is the place where Egypt's idea of eternity met the stubborn, damaged, human reality of time. At dusk, the Valley of the Kings changes its tone. The heat loosens its grip. The cliffs lose their hard glare. Entrances that looked almost ordinary in daylight begin to seem older than their own dates, as if the mountain has drawn them back into itself, the paths empty. The numbered tombs remain where they have always been, but the human noise around them thins, and the valley becomes what it has so often been beneath the attention, a place of waiting. Not silent, exactly. Silence is too simple a word for it. The valley holds too much disturbance for silence. Too many doors opened. Too many bodies moved. Too many names damaged, guessed at, restored, argued over, photographed, and filed into reports. Too many floods have passed through it. Too many hands have carried stone, linen, resin, coffins, tools, cameras, notebooks, and doubt. What remains at dusk is not silence. It is aftersound. The aftersound of work, of ritual, of fear, of discovery, of all the things done here, because people could not bear to let death be merely death. That may be the most human truth the valley preserves. Behind the divine language, behind the royal titles, behind the gold and painted gods, there is a stubborn refusal. A refusal to let a body disappear. A refusal to let a name vanish. A refusal to let power end at the edge of breath. The Egyptians who built and used this place did not think of death as an empty stop. They treated it as a passage so dangerous and important that it demanded architecture, theology, labor, secrecy, and extraordinary care. And yet care was never enough by itself. The tombs were robbed. The seals broke. The names were altered. The royal dead were carried away from the places prepared for them. The valley that promised eternity became a record of how difficult eternity was to maintain. That is why its later discoveries matter so deeply. They make the place more honest. They take us beyond the fantasy of perfect preservation and show us the damaged survival beneath it. A stripped chamber can tell the truth. So can an empty coffin. So can a jar of embalming material. So can a tomb reused centuries after its first purpose. So can a body found in the wrong place, a child known only through fragments, or a queen whose absence continues to draw speculation precisely because the evidence refuses to become complete. The Valley of the Kings still listens, but it does not answer quickly. It answers in layers. One layer says kings were buried here with the ambition of gods. Another says their bodies were vulnerable. Another says priests returned in crisis. Another says robbers knew more than the builders hoped. Another says floodwater became an accidental guardian. Another says later Egyptians still felt the pull of this ground. Another says modern archaeology, with all its instruments and caution, is still learning how to ask the right questions. This is not the clean ending that treasure stories prefer. A treasure story ends when the chamber opens. History begins to deepen after that. Because the real story, after Tutankhamun, was never that the valley had one more spectacular secret waiting to rival his golden tomb. The real story was that the valley did not need to rival him. Its quieter evidence was not less important because it was less dazzling. It was important because it revealed the systems behind the spectacle, the families, the crises, the religious reversals, the emergency reburials, the sacred leftovers, the reused tombs, the workers' traces, and the geological accidents that shaped what survived. After the golden coffin, the story did not become brighter. It became deeper. Darker, yes, but not in the cheap sense of curses and theatrical dread. Darker, because it moved closer to the fragile places where history is made. Uncertainty, damage, loss, and human decision. The darkness of the valley is not simply the darkness inside tombs. It is the darkness between what ancient people intended and what time allowed to remain. A king intended permanence. Time left fragments. A priest intended protection. Time left confusion. A family intended memory. Time left names that specialists still debate. An embalmer intended transformation. Time left materials, residues, and empty containers. A royal tomb intended to say, "This person will never be forgotten." And still, forgetting entered. That is what makes the valley moving rather than merely impressive. It is not a monument to absolute success. It is a monument to effort. The effort to resist decay. The effort to organize the unknown. The effort to turn a human body into something eternal, even while the world outside the tomb kept changing. The pharaohs wanted to step outside time, but their tombs remained inside it. They remained inside politics, weather, theft, devotion, reuse, excavation, tourism, conservation, debate, and modern imagination. They became less like sealed messages from the past, and more like long conversations interrupted by centuries. Every generation that touched them changed the conversation. Ancient workers began it. Priests revised it. Robbers violated it. Floods obscured it. Archaeologists translated it. Viewers like us enter it only at the very end, and even then, only for a moment. This should make us humble. The valley has been explored, but not exhausted. Mapped, but not fully understood. Famous, but still capable of being misread. Some questions may be answered by future evidence. Others may remain permanently out of reach, not because the right person has not looked hard enough, but because the evidence was destroyed before history could preserve it. That too must be accepted. Not every lost tomb waits to be found. Not every missing name will return. Not every mystery is a locked door. Some mysteries are gaps where the door itself has vanished. And yet the valley still matters because enough remains. Enough to see that royal death was not a single shining event, but an entire human system. Enough to see that famous kings depended on unnamed hands. Enough to see that sacred order could be damaged and repaired. Enough to see that memory was political, fragile, and sometimes dangerous. Enough to see that the most revealing discoveries are not always the ones that make the world gasp, but the ones that make the story more difficult and more true. As the light fades from the cliffs, the entrances become dark openings again. Some lead to chambers emptied long ago, some to painted corridors now protected by careful limits, some to spaces whose meanings have changed more than once. Around them lie sealed cracks, disturbed ground, old debris, and the possibility that some modest trace still waits beneath the stone. Not necessarily a golden king, not necessarily a famous queen, but perhaps something smaller and more instructive. A fragment, a deposit, a mark, a clue that changes the arrangement of everything around it. That is enough. The Valley of the Kings does not owe us another Tutankhamun. It has already given something larger. The reminder that history is not preserved only in splendor. It is preserved in damaged rooms, uncertain bodies, reused coffins, practical materials, and the stubborn traces of people trying to make meaning survive. Howard Carter's candle-lit glimpse into the golden tomb became the image everyone remembered. But beyond that glow, the valley kept its deeper story. Not a story of final answers, a story of returns. The dead returned through excavation. Old tombs returned through new questions. Forgotten children returned through fragments. Royal bodies returned from hiding. Sacred materials returned from what once looked like waste. And the valley itself returned, again and again, from the mistaken belief that it had nothing left to say. So when we imagine Tutankhamun's golden coffin, we should not imagine a full stop. We should imagine a door. Behind it was not simply another treasure chamber, but a more unsettling truth. that the real history of the Valley of the Kings was never only about what Egypt buried. It was about what Egypt tried to save, and what time, despite everything, refused to keep whole.